there is no longer a federal constitutional right to an abortion.
And the Supreme Court has overturned Roe v. Wade.
At the moment, America and women's rights went back in time.
It's going to be legal chaos.
We just learned that I got 30-day fines for disobeying the police.
Her alleged crime? Violating the country's strict dress code.
Women remain significantly underrepresented in leadership roles across policy and power structures. As such, women's leadership marginalization is in fact a significant threat to tackling the global issues of the 21st century. So the Johns Hopkins SAIS University provides a platform to serve the global community in this arena through the SAIS Women Lead initiative.
Women's leadership is crucial, and I think SAIS Women Lead is a wonderful vehicle, a wonderful community for tackling what it means to be a woman leader in the field.
I think SAIS has an enormously important role to play in shaping the global gender equality agenda. We know that women play an incredible role in dealing with issues like public health. And that research that we do here can help bring to broader awareness of the fact that how gender equality is not just a value in its own right, as a human right, but also something that has broad positive social implications.
When it comes to solving complex global problems, women have to be in the room. Whether it's economics, climate change, or public health, women are often the ones who are disproportionately affected by these issues. So it's critical that they're in the room to create long-lasting, sustainable solutions.
So in a time when there are global crises all around the world, I think it's really important for the leaders today to be acting not out of self-interest or out of corporate interest, but really out of a deep dedication to serving their community. And it's been proven time and time again that women leaders are especially good at coming to the negotiating table and serving their communities with those attributes.
I believe that authentic leadership means listening, learning, and being willing to challenge not only societal assumptions, but also our own internal assumptions to problem solve and lead effectively.
As a doctoral student focusing on the Africa region, I have gained an in-depth understanding of the continent and how to tackle the multifaceted challenges that affect women in areas such as economic development and conflict resolution.
With this new location, we aim to expand our programmatic, research-focused and convening impact through strategic partnerships. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is a true honor to welcome each of you back to the SAIS Women Lead International Leadership Annual Summit. The theme for this year, Envisioning a Just World, feels more urgent than ever. As we reflect on the challenges of our time, it is clear that this is not just an abstract conversation. We are living through a pivotal moment in history. So today we come together to share insights, stories, and ideas as we envision a future that is just, equitable, inclusive, and sustainable. From Sudan to Ukraine to the Middle East, we're witnessing the brutal consequences of conflicts waged by men, by those in power. Conflicts that have devastated families, with women and children bearing the heaviest burdens, and very often having these conflicts and these wars fought on their bodies as though it were battlegrounds. In fact, as the main battlegrounds. Meanwhile, democracy is strained by nationalist populism, and racial and gender injustices are exacerbated by opportunists who pathologize social cleavages and exploit economic hardship for their own political and economic gain. These forces seek to undermine institutions, divert resources, and prevent us from addressing the real challenges we're facing, like those of closing the gender gap in education, health, economic opportunity, and political power. But despite the bleakness of today's scorecard, we must not relent. We must continue to fight, to hope, and to envision a future that is truly just, because the alternative is unthinkable. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome the extraordinary professionals, scholars, and advocates who are joining us today. Their work and dedication, whether in addressing global inequalities, advancing gender justice, promoting sustainable energy solutions, or strengthening health systems, will guide and inspire our discussions. I'm equally excited to hear from our students, whose voices and visions for a just world will frame today's conversations. These students, brave and insightful, will share their personal journeys and ideas, reminding us that the future we're fighting for is theirs as much as ours. We're especially honored to have Her Excellency Dr. Vjosa Osmani, the President of the Republic of Kosovo, as our keynote speaker. President Osmani's leadership in Kosovo and on the global stage is a testament and is a profound example of what can be achieved when justice is at the center of our work. Her presence today is a powerful reminder that change is possible and that leadership, when rooted in justice, can transform societies. Throughout the day, our panels will delve into three critical issues: harnessing disruptive technologies for justice, bridging the gap in economic disparities, global health and justice in a post-pandemic era, building resilience through equity, and ensuring a sustainable future, the intersection of climate action and energy justice. After the formal program, I invite you all to join us in the breezeway for some entertainment and refreshments, and of course, networking, an opportunity to connect, reflect, and continue the important conversations we'll begin here today. Thank you all for being here, for your commitment, and for your voices. Together, let's envision and build a just world. We also invite you to tweet during the program using the handle Swirls24. That's up on the slide. Again, thank you and welcome. And now join me in welcoming our own Professor Narges Bajogli for the opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a true honor to be here with all of you all today in this incredible gathering of SAIS Women Lead and their International Leadership Summit. First, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to the SAIS Women Lead team for all of their work in putting together today's events. And I would like to personally thank Vice Dean Nwankor for her exemplary leadership of the SAIS Women Lead program over these many years. Her guidance has shaped this initiative into what it is today, a beacon of empowerment, a force for change, and a platform for many of the brightest students and most driven women leaders of tomorrow, especially at an institution like SAIS, where it's so sorely needed. I also want to acknowledge all of the students in the room today. You're stepping into a world that can feel overwhelming, full of uncertainty and instability and violence. Yet it's also a world filled with potential. I see in each of you the capacity to shape the future, to confront these challenges with resilience and struggle, and to reimagine what leadership and justice can look like in these turbulent times. Your presence here today and in our classrooms every day signals your commitment to that mission. And often you all, our students, are the only reasons I can even bear to continue showing up every day. As we gather to reflect on this year's theme, Envisioning a Just World, I want to ground our conversation in the realities of the moments we're living through. We're witnessing unprecedented crises, industrial warming that threatens the very survival of the planet, and live-stream genocides in Palestine, Sudan, and Congo. Those are not distant events. They are global crises, and they are hitting the most vulnerable, especially women and children, the hardest. Princeton anthropologist Yarimar Bonilla has described this moment as one of disaster swarms, a series of overlapping and interlocking crises that crash into one another, making the challenges that we face more complex and more difficult to solve, and oftentimes we're even unable to understand where they are all coming from. In the world of mental health, this phenomenon is called polycrises, a perfect storm of issues that reinforce each other, from climate catastrophe to political collapse, economic inequities, and public health emergencies. It's not just one crisis, it's many happening all at once, everywhere, interconnected. But at the same time, we are also in an era of unprecedented feminist movements. From Iran to Chile, from the Sudan to Mexico to the streets of New York City, young women and men are leading the charge, connecting the struggles of our time across geography and space. They're not just resisting one form of oppression, but understanding the interconnected nature of the systems that govern our world: patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, and environmental destruction. It's a moment of great violence, yes, but it's also a moment of great rebellion. And like all movements, these rebellions are not perfect. As any historian or anthropologist or sociologist will tell you, no movement ever is. Many of these movements carry within them the potential to recreate the very structures of dominations that they seek to upend. Like we saw in the global rebellions of the 1960s and 70s, many of which gave way to deeply patriarchal and authoritarian aftermaths. And yet, in the movements of today, there is an attention to envisioning a future that takes seriously the need to form bonds away from domination. As I teach my students, one of the things I've learned through my work as an anthropologist is that there are two constants in human history: the constant of power and domination in one form or another, and the constant of rebellion and the human desire for freedom and dignity. These two forces will always be in tension with one another, morphing and responding to each other over time. As we stand in this moment, witnessing both unprecedented crises and unprecedented rebellion, I ask you, what future are we envisioning, and for whom? Can we truly say we are striving for a just world if we do not confront the rise of authoritarianism and fascism, the continued colonial extraction of resources, often now in the name of clean energy and green energy, which in many parts of the world has become a new form of neo-colonial exploitation? We're seeing the impacts of AI technology on our societies. While much of the conversation is centered around robots replacing our jobs or dystopian futures, we rarely talk about the material extraction and the human cost that underpins this technology. The minerals, the labor, the communities that are displaced, all these elements make up the hidden cost of the future we are being told to celebrate. And these issues are no longer abstract. They're glaring us in the face, demanding that we confront them, often every time we pick up our phones and scroll through our feeds. So today, as we engage in these critical discussions that lie ahead, I urge us all to ask difficult questions. What does a just future truly look like? Who are we building it for, and who are we leaving behind in our visions? How can we ensure that our efforts to dismantle systems of oppression that have left women out don't simply replace them with new forms of domination? In years past, we may have been able to gloss over these complexities, treating them as secondary or distant concerns, as sort of abstract things that were there, but we didn't have to deal with for our basis. But today, they're intertwined with our daily lives. As women leaders, as scholars, some as advocates and activists, and perhaps some as feminists among us, we have a responsibility to engage with these crises head on. Let today's conversations be bold, let them be critical, and let them challenge the easy answers. Together, with intention, we can move towards envisioning a future that's truly just, a future that does not simply respond to crises and leave out the great majority of the world's populations, but envisions new possibilities for safety, dignity, belonging, and equality for all. Thank you very much, and I very much look forward to all of the powerful conversations that we'll have today.
Thank you, Professor Nargis, for that wonderful remarks. What does a just future look like? Who are we building it for, and who are we leaving behind? Words to live by. Thank you.
Say what you need to say. 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 Say what you need to say.
Again, what does a just future look like? Who are we building it for? And who are we leaving behind? To help us frame these questions and these conversations, we would like to start with another truly special part of the summit, the student monologues. These monologues are a chance for us to hear the personal reflections of our students and our student community, stories that reflect their unique journeys, challenges, and hopes for a just world. Our students express the theme of the day not just as a concept, but as personal truths. Their words speak to the power of resilience, the courage to envision a better future, and the determination to be agents of change. Let's welcome Esther, Aisha, and Lauren to the stage.
So, I have a confession to make. I hate words. Sometimes. I'll tell you a story about it. You see, I was a very trusting child, and my amazing mother, she knew that. She knew that the best way to get me to do something that I didn't want to do was by promising me something else in return. And she had one favorite word: tomorrow. So, for instance, I'd go up to my mother and I'd be like, "Mom, can we go to the mall today?" And she'd be like, "Oh, go wash the dishes. We'll go tomorrow," right? And then tomorrow comes up and I go up to her and I ask her the question and she just says, "No." And this happened over and over and over again, and each time my hopes would go up, but then they would get crushed. And each time, I just hated words a little bit more. And as I grew older, my disdain for words shifted a little bit. This time it was, "Hey, so I've been thinking," or "Trust me, it's not anything you did, but," or sometimes it was, "You're breaking out again. Have you been washing your face?" Or, "You're eating too much," or, "Why aren't you eating so much?" And each time these words would pierce my heart, and I would just hate words a little bit more. But maybe it's not the words that I hated. Maybe it's what those words mean, how those words were used that I hated. For instance, I realized that some words are just so discriminatory because you can have someone from a high socioeconomic status or a preferred country travel to another country for work and they're an expat. Oh, but when the same person from a lower socioeconomic status moves to another country for work, suddenly they're a migrant worker. And there are other words that are so reductive because you can have a complex human being who's the sum of all their experiences. But as soon as you slap the word refugee on them, suddenly that complex person has been overshadowed by just their current situation. And yet, that's not the full story though, is it? Because I have to admit, there are moments when I do love words. Words are so amazing in that they can translate complex ideas, they can inspire action, and they can connect people. For instance, you can call something ethnic conflict or political violence, oh, but then suddenly, if you call it genocide, the stakes are different. Suddenly, it's not just a conflict that's far away. Suddenly, you have a responsibility to act. But then there are other words that are just as important, but somehow they're still so abstract. Like the word justice. When you think of justice, what do you imagine? When you hear justice, what are you supposed to do? You see, in moments like these, I like to think of explaining such abstract words through stories. And I think that kind of applies here. We are all here to explore what justice looks like in context, so we all agree that it's an important concept. And throughout this day, you're going to hear so many different versions of the stories that make up the word justice. And when this is all over, it's going to be up to you to decide and up to you to come up with the answer to the question, what does a just world look like to you? Thank you.
First, I would like to acknowledge and honor the ancestral lands that we occupy today. The ancestral lands of the Nankonchtak, the Pamunkey, and the Piscataway Native peoples. Hidden in the corner of rural Minnesota, I grew up in a small town called Worthington. And in that small town, the global was exemplified in the local, making my community home to newly migrated refugees and immigrants from Burma, Sudan, Guatemala, and like my own family, Eritrea. But to me, the cultural plurality and the growing racial and ethnic diversity of my town did not merely consist of relishing in diverse cuisines or attending the annual international festival, but rather consisted of understanding and navigating the social, political, and cultural nuances that reflect the perils and promise of working class America. It was in the broken English, the packed minivans with direction to the local pork plant, and sights of a failed American dream where I found a sense of meaning. As a young girl, envisioning a just world was not merely an abstract line of thought. Envisioning a just world was and continues to be a practice. And as a little girl, it was the practice of being the only Black girl in the advanced high school courses. For me, it was the practice of applying to top-ranked colleges despite my high school counselor insisting that it would be too hard for me. Envisioning a just world was and is the practice of asserting myself in situations, asserting myself in spaces that were not created for me, but still making that space for myself. Growing up in rural Minnesota, I witnessed, experienced, and learned from my community's struggles and my community's resilience. And from that, I learned that I will never know unless I try. and today as the first in my family to receive a higher education. Envisioning a just world continues to be a guiding practice. So after my SAIS experience, and as I go on to pursue a career in international relations, who will I be? And how will I continue to advocate for my community? How will I continue to uplift the voices of those unheard, the voices of those underrepresented, and the voices of those underserved? You see, to me, envisioning a just world is that in the face of structural barriers, in the face of systemic injustices, we all can take actionable steps and participate in the advancement of inclusion, the advancement of equity, and the advancement of justice for all. Thank you very much.
When we talk about envisioning a just world, for me, it's more than just a philosophical concept. It's deeply personal. My journey toward understanding justice began when I was just 9 years old. That was the year that my father was deported, forced to leave the only home I had ever known, and my mother had to raise my brother by herself. This was a moment that shattered my family, but it was also the beginning of a journey that shaped who I am today. I didn't have the same privileges as many of my peers growing up. I remember having to sell candy from Mexico that my family and I bought just to afford to go on school field trips, and borrowing my music teacher's violin so I can play alongside my school's orchestra. My dad has missed every major milestone in my life, from birthdays to graduations, because of the borders that separate us. Today, my father still resides in Mexico, navigating the slow and painful US immigration system. But my parents taught me not to let these challenges bring me down. They told me not to beg for others to help me, but to be my own advocate and a voice for others. And that's exactly what I've done. I remember my father always telling me, "Mija, you're going to be an important person in life, and I know you're going to do great things." I never really resonated with these words until now, given the honor to stand before you all today and share my story. My mother, despite all of the hardship, has been a beacon of hope for me and my biggest inspiration in life. As a first-generation, low-income student, I have felt the weight of the barriers that hold so many students like me from succeeding. But this has given me the drive to become an advocate and a voice for those who feel like they can't make it in life. I have helped friends and family members navigate the arduous process of obtaining visas so they too can access better opportunities, so they can become their own advocate and a voice for others. My time at SAIS has only deepened my resolve. I have had the privilege of speaking with individuals from around the world who have shared with me the global challenges that many abroad face, such as lack of food and water security, climate crises, and domestic violence, just to name a few. These aren't just abstract issues, but reality for millions. It is a privilege to be here standing before you all today to have these types of discussions when many abroad must wonder when they'll have their next meal, if they'll ever see their family members again, or if they'll make it to the next day. This is why, for me, justice isn't just a dream, but a necessity. It is in moments like these where we must ask ourselves what we can do to provide a just world for everyone, no matter where they're from, to have a chance to succeed, to be given a voice, and to live with dignity. Together, let us be the voice for those who feel voiceless, for those who are fighting a battle they didn't choose. Together, we can create a just world, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that follow. Thank you.
Before I start, let us recognize again the strong messages of our incredible peers shared with us. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed moderator for our first panel discussion of this afternoon, Dr. Belinda Archibong. Dr. Archibong is an associate professor of economics here at SAIS and research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Her research investigates the role of historical institutions and environment in inequality of access to public services and the development of human capital, especially in African nations. Her current research topics include work on climate change, epidemics, taxes, employment, and gender. She received a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Philosophy and a PhD in Sustainable Development from Columbia University. She will be leading the discussion on how disruptive technologies can be harnessed to bridge the gap in economic disparities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Archibong.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very, very much to Dean Nwankwo and all of the fantastic speakers that we've had so far, the students, our introductory speaker, Professor Nargis earlier. I will introduce our panel and we're gonna talk about whether or not technology can save us. Anyway, we'll see. At the very least, whether or not technology can lead us to a more just world, especially regarding reducing gender inequality across the world. So it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce our two fantastic speakers on our panel for today. First, we have Stefania Fabrizio. Stefania is at the IMF, so she is the unit chief of the Gender and Inclusion Unit in the Strategy, Policy, and Review Department of the IMF, so the International Monetary Fund. Previously, she worked in the Fiscal Affairs Department, European Department, and African Department. And prior to joining the IMF, she was a visiting professor at the University of Salamanca, Spain. She holds a PhD in economics from the European University Institute, Florence, Italy. And her research covers a range of issues in the area of gender economics, development economics, public finance, and macroeconomics. Our second speaker is Wendy Teleki. She is the head of the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative, WIFI, I think, is that how you pronounce it? WIFI? Secretariat, which is housed in the World Bank and supports women entrepreneurs in over 60 developing countries around the world. WIFI also works with multilateral development banks and local institutions to increase women entrepreneurs' access to finance, markets, skills, and technology through investments, technical assistance, and policy reforms. Prior to joining WIFI in 2019, Mr. Leckie worked at the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. So we have, again, fantastic speakers with a wealth of knowledge across the public and private sector, and of course across the the kind of development banks, IMF, and the World Bank as well. So I'm going to introduce our speakers to come up, please, and we're going to start our discussion. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Should I hold this? Is this, okay, I'm going to sit back. Is everybody hearing me through this mic? No? Yeah? All right, let's pick that up then. What about now? Excellent. All right. Okay, so as I said, we are hoping that, especially with the rise of many different technologies, we'll talk a little bit about AI, but technologies that allow us to access labor markets more easily, finance more easily. We have mobile money, things that allow us to do all these things that we have not been able to do prior and also that have allowed women, who are often the least advantaged people and populations in many countries around the world, to access labor markets, to access finance, all of these things, as I mentioned before, that we haven't been able to access as easily before. So let me start with Stefania. If you could spend a few minutes to talk about this question, right? Especially given your work at the IMF, and thinking about how, in particular, the IMF is working with these technologies, so integrating the potential for disruptive technologies into its gender and inclusion strategies to enhance economic justice globally, and also if you can speak to any specific scenarios regarding this topic as well. So that would be great. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. This is really a great honor for me, and I really like to see students. The future, and they will have to grab the opportunities going forward. So let me start with say that the IMF's gender strategy really starts from the recognition that reducing gender inequality goes hand in hand with sustainable growth and macroeconomic stability, which are two main goals of the IMF mandate. As such, the work that we do on gender at the IMF, it's really meant to focus on factors, including technologies and macroeconomic policy, to support women to develop in full their human capital potential and use it for their own good, but for the good of the economy and the society as a whole. So with that in mind, the IMF is helping countries, or our teams are helping countries in crafting policies that can support women to face, women and the population as a whole, to face the challenges, but also grab the opportunities that shocks and factors like technologies pose. So in this context, for example, there are a lot of studies out there predicting the likelihood that artificial intelligence will destroy certain place jobs. But we know that artificial intelligence can also complement the human work. And a recent study by the IMF predicts that 40% of jobs will be affected globally by artificial intelligence. And women, with their high presence in service sectors, they have a great exposure to artificial intelligence, but they are also they're better placed to reap the benefit of artificial intelligence. At the same time, we have another, just came out a few weeks ago, another study on the green transition. The green transition, green jobs really can offer great opportunity to women, as we find that the wage premium for this job, associated with this job, are higher for women than for men. Yet, only 1/3 of the green jobs are held by women. And why that? Because women don't really have the right skills, the essential skills for engineering, for the clear energy, for the technological sector to drive innovation. In fact, only in many, many countries, less than 1/3 of graduates in STEM are women. So if we don't take action, we are really increasing the differences of the gender inequality instead of grabbing the opportunities.
Thank you very much, Stefania. We'll come back to this question of skills too. I think this is very interesting. Similar question, but from the kind of private sector view side. So, Wendy, again, given your experience about WIFI and the IFC, what roles are you seeing for disruptive technologies, like we talked about before, like again, everyone's thinking about AI, but not just AI, digital finance, the mobile money, etc. What role are you seeing for this, for improving women's access to finance, especially in developing countries as well?
Thanks, and thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be back at SAIS. As you mentioned in the introduction, the program that I run sits at the World Bank and supports women entrepreneurs around the world. And a lot of what we do is focus on making sure women entrepreneurs have access to finance. So we know that there's a $1.7 trillion financing gap for women entrepreneurs, and there's many reasons for that. And so we have a lot of programs working with banks, with fintechs, with venture capital funds, and with policymakers to try to address those gaps. And there's technology is very important. But to understand why technology is important, it's important to understand why women-led businesses, in the case of what we do, are really differ from businesses that are male-led. Women-led businesses tend to be smaller. They tend to have smaller margins, mainly because they work in low-margin sectors, in service sectors, and other areas. Women are less likely to have assets that they can use as collateral. So they have challenges getting access to finance if it needs to be secured. Women also have lower levels of digital literacy and financial literacy, which creates challenges with them getting access to finance. And women also have challenges with mobility, often because they have care responsibilities at home, or even because the enabling environment or the security environment in their country makes it difficult for them to get about freely. So women have very real differences in the way they run businesses than men, and there's also bias in financial systems, so in the ways that financial systems are set up to serve women. So digital can play a really important and powerful role in helping get women more access to finance. First of all, it can lower the price of financing because it can make it more efficient to give loans and get them access to finance. It can help banks really understand market behaviors better so that they can understand what women need and how that might differ from men. And so the AI that can really look at different market data or use algorithms to understand borrowing behaviors can be really powerful. And also digital can help with the financial literacy challenges. So we see a lot of examples of text-based digital literacy activities or other kinds of training that use market intelligence or natural language models. So there's a lot that can be done. And probably the central piece where AI comes in is on understanding risk and understanding the credit security of the borrowers. So really trying to understand what the repayment capacity is of the borrower. And digital can take out some of the biases that humans have in this. But it can play the other role as well. There's a pretty famous example with the Apple credit card where a tech entrepreneur and his wife both applied for the card, and the tech entrepreneur and they had the same assets, same accounts. He got a 20 times higher credit limit than his wife did. And so, a lot of questions about how the algorithms come up with that in that case. So it has a threat. It's a threat as well. And this is, something that we really need to work with the financial institutions on if they're going to harness the power of digital and really help them use digital in the right ways for training for financial literacy, and also to make sure that women just have the access to digital. So it's one thing, if they can walk into a branch, if the branch is there, but it's another thing if they have the digital phone to have a digital wallet and to make payments. So there's a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunity in this space.
Thank you. So we'll come back to this question of bias, which is very interesting. Yeah. If we have time, we'll see. I'll let you guys ask questions, don't worry. Mm-hmm. But I also have a lot of questions. It's fantastic. Stefania, going back to you again. So thinking about what Wendy mentioned about the challenges that women face in developing countries, especially, right? One of the things, I was watching this BBC news, Africa news thing today, and they were talking about esports. People know esports. I was not aware that that was a thing that you could do for a living, like for real. But they were talking about how this is a potential thing that can happen in Africa. But many of the Kenyan, for example, players are saying, well, we have access to internet issues, access to data issues. This makes it very difficult for us to compete against people like in the US, where internet is stable and cheap to access. So thinking about these types of resource constraints in developing countries, how can local economies in developing countries then adapt to this shift to these technologies, be it AI, be it access to digital finance, in ways where people and women especially can really leverage this, especially given these types of resource constraints that Wendy mentioned, right? So I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Okay, so let's start with saying that advanced economies right now are predicted to be the most exposed to artificial intelligence, for example, like 60% of jobs, while in developing country, the exposure is expected to be between 25-40%. This suggests that developing countries don't face immediate risk to disruptive technologies. But at the same time, they also face the issue that they cannot benefit from the technology at the same time. Based on a preparedness index, artificial intelligence preparedness index that we have developed at the IMF, that is basically look at how prepared are countries in terms of infrastructure, digital infrastructure, in terms of labor markets, in terms of regulations. We see that advanced economies, though they are the most risked, are also the most prepared to embrace the benefit of the artificial intelligence and technologies. And in particular, clearly there is variation among all countries, but countries like the US, Germany, Japan, given their digital infrastructure, are really posed to reap the benefits of artificial intelligence. While we have low-income countries that in general face the major challenges due to the lack of digital infrastructure and a digitally able workforce. So these are the two areas that really are priority for developing countries, investing and preparing for, by investing in digital infrastructure and prepare the labor force. Education in STEM that we mentioned, I mentioned earlier for women in particular, it's really an important to invest in and create incentive for women to go into STEM and equip them with the skills to harness the technology and an AI-driven economy. For example, Ireland is really a good example in that. In 8 years, they tripled the women graduates with a STEM degree, and that was by really introducing STEM topics at all levels of education, in particular focus on early education, and preparing gender-focused curricula, and also in making training for the instructors themselves. So these are a really important area. And in developing countries where rural, for example, or there are really communities, there are AI platforms are really good for learning and for preparing the skills. And Rwanda, for example, is a good example. In the AI strategy, there is a big focus on this type of teaching and learning.
No, so this is, again, fantastic, good to hear. I'm happy that the IMF has this as a focus. We'll come back to that. Wendy, going back to you. So going on this theme of what are the practical things that we can do? What, especially when we talk about women entrepreneurs. You mentioned earlier their businesses tend to be small. I think they tend to be more like micro enterprises. They tend to have, for a number of issues, like the bias, the skills, all of that, less access to finance in general to grow the businesses. So what kind of practical solutions for this, for women, especially for women entrepreneurs who are trying to access finance and using these digital platforms?
Yeah, so the first step is getting them online. And so the digital gap between men and women is pretty significant in developing countries, although it's closing, which is great. But it's really important that they not only have access to, say, a phone or the internet, but also that they have some control over that, right? It's not just borrowing their husband's phone or their son's phone, or, but they can actually use it and move around with it. So that's really the first step. And then the second step is developing products and services that meet their needs. What we find is there's been a lot of great work on digital ID to make sure women and men have digital IDs, and then a gateway to get more women using finance for using digital services is if there's social payments online, so that they're getting that access to financing or funding of some kind online. But then we want to see the financial institutions moving in and providing payment services, credit services, and other financial services to them using digital means. So that you have to kind of walk with them through these various processes to get them to the point where they have access to the finance and also the literacy to use the finance, so or all of the financial services. And from the financial service side, they really need to think about the product design and how they embed gender in the way they think about their products. So even banks aren't even able, in probably most cases, I would say still, to say whether an enterprise is a woman-led or a male-led enterprise. It's not embedded in the systems. They don't have ways to surface whether it's if it's a company that has several shareholders. How do they define that as a women-led business? And so then they're unable to really understand what that market looks like. And so we've been looking at different models for how banks can actually figure that out, and AI turns out to be a really good way for banks to really identify where women entrepreneurs are in their client base. They might be consumers, they might have a credit line, a credit card, but they don't use it or for their business. So how do you really help the bank or the financial institution understand where there are women and how you can design services for them? And we've seen AI used for that purpose. The other really great example is embedded finance, where women are getting access to payments, or they're making payments online for services, or maybe they're part of a value chain, and those value chain purchases are online. And how can you design products and services so that you can get credit to them as well? Once you're able to use kind of alternative sources of credit information to understand what the behaviors are of that entrepreneur, that might give you much better insight than a loan officer looking at the person across the table and looking at some forms which might not be as accessible for women, or looking at collateral which might not be accessible for women. It turns out to be a much better way to get financing to women when it's embedded with these other financial services that are being provided. And we have an example with a project that IDB, one of our partners, worked on in Mexico with an organization called Confio. When they were lending on this kind of algorithm-based lending, on average, sales increased by 19% for all of the firms, but for women it increased 45%. And it really goes to show how scarce that funding is for women and how much they benefit disproportionately than men. So there's a lot of really good examples there about how you can use these algorithms and this AI to really make a difference for women entrepreneurs in the market, and women as consumers as well.
This is great. You guys are giving us optimism, which is fantastic. You don't often hear optimism when it comes to many of these issues around gender inequality, so thank you very much. So one last question before we open it up to the audience. So thinking about policies, right, especially policies in both the public sector and the private sector, that when we talk about tech, who runs the tech, who's in charge of the tech, who is, guiding the development of the technology. All this might be important, right, when we talk about the impact of the tech on marginalized populations. So in your experience, again, what kind of policies should be considered to ensure that the benefits of these types of technologies are equitably distributed by gender, and also then are able to be accessed, in a hopefully less costly way for members of marginalized populations, members of historically underserved populations. So I guess in your vantage points from the public IMF world and also the more private side as well. So I guess, yeah, please, Stefania.
Maybe I can start more from the macro policies. So we have talked about the importance of building digital infrastructure, make sure that people have access to internet, people have access to digital also literacy, right? So the education is also very, very critical, both to be part of that world, actually, but also to be able to understand what is out there. So, but we also think that there are some workers that we have to realize they cannot be, it's very difficult for them to retraining because maybe they're old people or because they are left behind for any other reason. And we need to put in place comprehensive social safety net for those people. We cannot leave them behind. With that in mind, I will also say that, women face barrier, and here that we are talking about technology, but women still face barrier that exist a long time before AI, right? And tackling those barriers in the labor market, in the barriers in law, barriers in financial access, barriers that women face day to day is still very, very important. And that's what we have been focusing a lot over the past, in particular the past 2 years since the onset of the strategy. We have worked with about 50 countries so far, and we have tried to help countries to assess the cost of these barriers for the economy as a whole, and also to craft policies to support this barrier. Women very often face trade-off between education, work, work at home, and so the policy that help them to alleviate those constraints, both in terms of time and in terms of financial constraints, are critical. So quality childcare still missing in many countries. The parental leave that allowed people to, also have a fair share of the burden. Legal barriers, we are talking about financial access. For example, in India, we know that there's been a program put in place for women to face extreme events in agriculture, and there are places, financing, putting subsidies for support to agriculture, but women don't have the title. So they work the land, they actually have, but they don't have the title. So they don't have even access to those subsidies. So there are all these barriers. They're old, like the world, but we still need to face them and to tackle them.
Thank you very much, Stefania. Apparently, we have only a few minutes left before we have to open up to the audience. So please, Wendy, what is your 2 minutes response to the question? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with all of those. Those were all on my list too. I mean, the infrastructure is really critical. On the legal front, we know women around the world have about 75% of the legal rights of men. All of you should know Women, Business, and the Law, which is just a great database that shows country by country what legal rights women have. And I would say some other things are skills, making sure that there's efforts to get women into digital and training and STEM sectors, but also getting women or breaking down barriers for women going into generally non-traditional sectors for women. I mentioned at the beginning, women are really tend to cluster in very low margin, low profitability, low growth sectors. And that hinders their ability to have, better income, provide for their children, innovate. Some of the more innovative sectors they're not involved in, including growth sectors like the green sector. So really trying to do more to break down barriers for women to move into these sectors will do a lot to boost equity for men and women. And then there's also things like procurement policies that governments can have to try to ensure that the services that are being provided through governments but provided by the private sector are equitable, so that women and men, are being hired at the same rates, or women-led firms have equal access to employment contracts. Things like that can be really important for balancing the playing field between men and women.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thank you very much to you both. We have 5, 2, 3, okay, 3-ish minutes for questions. So, do we have a mic? Is that what's happening? Oh yes, please come up to the mic.
Hello. I have a question for Wendy. So I work in the microfinance industry, and as we know, this industry was initially designed to improve financing for women entrepreneurs. But as the industry got commercialized, there's a mission drift that those finance institutions are increasingly lend to male borrowers and lend to those larger MSMEs that doesn't necessarily run by women, and then those investment funds increasingly investing more commercialized financial institutions that miss the bottom of the pyramid that tend to be women entrepreneurs. So I wonder, how do you address this mission drift, and how do you make sure that if disruptive technology can create a product or like a disruptive industry that cater to women, how can we make sure men doesn't take the space of women?
Yeah, so absolutely. That's something you see. And I think, we do want to see a diverse financial sector. So we want to see institutions at all levels. We want micro enterprises and small businesses and large businesses all to have access to finance. So, it's great because there's also not a lot of SME financing out there when there's SME providers, but it's not great when the micro sector is leaving behind the people that it was created for. I do think technology is a great way to help those microfinance institutions become more efficient and profitable, or using digital services to stay with the segments that they were in. And I'm going to give you an example of a bank in South Africa called Time Bank, which is a digital bank. It's not a microfinance institution. But it's created an entirely digital model, not entirely, but digital first model for banking. And they put their banking services, they don't have branches, they have like ATMs, that they're kiosks that they set up in grocery stores. And there's usually somebody there helping onboard new clients. And then people can get their financial services at the place that they shop. And they embed a lot of data in their algorithms that helps them understand consumer behavior of the consumers who are coming to these small shops. And that allows them to tailor their products more efficiently to these borrowers and also keep their costs very low. So this is a very high-tech bank. It's using very sophisticated algorithms, but its most profitable and largest growth clientele are the poorest part of their segment. So they're really delivering a service that's better at reaching the lowest income level of clients than the higher level incomes of clients. So they've been able to use digital to really bring the cost down. And of course, lower income borrowers are more price sensitive, so they care more about that. they're able to give more embedded financial offers and incentives based on the true behavior of the clients, and in that way they can grow their business at that base of the pyramid. So there's other models. I mean, there's a lot of innovations happening out there. They're not all at scale. You know, some of them are more like payments oriented, just getting other financial services out to women. But I think there's a lot of innovation that's happening at that micro space. And so you may see some institutions coming up and down, and I think that can be troubling in markets where they're leaving, you know, the whole industry is leaving behind the lower scale. The other thing I would say is, sorry, there's a role for blended finance as well to really create incentives at the lower end as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Do we have time for one more question? 30 seconds. Okay, anyone have a 30-second question with a 30-second response?
I'm here.
Yes, please go.
Okay. I had more of a question that's maybe more long-term. This is specifically one of the things you say is businesses have a hard time to figure, or banks and financial institutions have a hard time to figure out if a business is women-led versus men-led, so that they can like cater their product offerings to that. Do you, and I'm sure you think about that at the World Bank, do you have like a plan for maybe the long-term consequences of that type of data being in the hands of financial institutions and banks, and the potential threat of bias in the future? Because we know how knowing very granular data on your consumer, what it can do to certain decisions on credit as well. So I wanted to know if that's like a risk that you see. How do you approach it? Do you work with governments, the legal field, to ensure that like laws protect women as well, especially in developing countries? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, there's...
This will be the 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there's kind of like in the U.S. for a long time, and it hasn't fully been resolved, it was illegal to use data, gender data at all in banking, right? So, or especially for credit decisions. If you don't know the gender of the businesses, though, you also can't tell if you're biased, right? So we believe it's better to have the data and then make sure you can check, and there's some transparency in terms of whether the lending decisions are free of bias. So there are things you can do, like have audits of algorithms and things like that, and at the same time layer on data privacy and anti-discrimination policies as well into the legal framework.
Thank you. And I'm assuming the IMF has indices that try and check like gender equality things, like the World Bank as well, Stefania. But not at the sectoral level. Ah, okay, at the macro level. Okay, excellent. So private and macro as well. Okay. Thank you to the audience. This is fantastic. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also, I was told that it is Wendy's birthday. Happy birthday, Wendy. Thank you to her for coming on her birthday. I did not work on my birthday, so thank you very much. This is my opinion. So we have something for you.
Oh, gosh.
Yes. Happy birthday.
Oh, okay. I'll pass them out. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
So the next panel that we'll be having will be on global health and justice in a post-pandemic era. And I'm excited to introduce our moderator, Dr. Kowalczyk, who is currently an associate scientist with the Johns Hopkins University. And she's a gender specialist with extensive experience in international settings. She serves as assistant director of the Johns Hopkins University Center of Global Health, which serves the entire university and seeks to promote interdisciplinarity in global health. Her work and research aims to improve the capacity of academic institutions to support global health training across the continuum of education. She's also the co-director of the Gender and Health Summer Institute, which offers applied courses for health trainings and professionals seeking skills in gender research and programming. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kowalczyk.
Good afternoon, everyone. This next fireside chat is going to be a little less formal, and I don't know if we're touching on the title here. I think we're going to be talking a little bit more about leadership at all levels, particularly given the expertise in community health and systems. So with that, let me please introduce my fellow fireside chattee. I'm not really sure what to call us. So Nan Chen is the co-executive director of Africa Frontline First, an Africa-led partnership from Community Health Impact Coalition, the Financing Alliance for Health, and Last Mile Health, to increase financing for community health to save and improve lives in Africa. Previously, Nan served as Managing Director, Health System Strengthening at Last Mile Health, supporting the organization's global work to understand what works and why in community health program scale. He also worked to diffuse lessons learned via partnerships and advocacy for community health systems in collaboration with peer organizations to support countries to strengthen their community health systems. Nan has also worked with the Millennium Challenge Corporation on public and private partnerships, policy analysis, and nutrition and stunting interventions. He has also advised, you've done a lot. He's also advised small and medium enterprises and impact investors in Kenya on pathways to scale for social enterprises and NGOs and social enterprises through the Harvard Law and International Development Society and Aspen Network for Development Entrepreneurs. He has a master in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School and a Juris Doctor from Northwestern University. So please join me in welcoming my fellow chattee.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
It's very nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise.
It is Friday afternoon. I've had a long week, so I'm ready to chat.
Okay, yeah, me too. That's a nice way to put it. I'm also ready to chat, especially about leadership.
Cool.
So, one of the things that really struck out for me as I was reading your bio and also like doing, pre-chat research was that your work is focused on, strengthening health systems for community health, which I think provides a lot of opportunity for us to talk about leadership and opportunities for justice across this spectrum, right? From community health workers and community health systems all the way up to governance and health system strengthening. So I think there's a really remarkable opportunity here to explore leadership at all levels. And so maybe the first question I would ask you is, what do you think is your leadership philosophy, and how does that translate into this field and into these spaces through a justice lens?
Wow, big question.
It's a Friday.
If I were to say my leadership philosophy, here's what I think. I think, and I was hearing these introductions and talks earlier about the poly crises, I think was the word, or the many different crises, whether it's climate justice or health or economic inequality. The thing that's going to get us as humanity out of these or forward with these is our ability to create bridges, to work in more complex collective ways. And so in terms of, I think if you asked where I just came back from a leadership retreat last week in Kenya, and I think if you were to ask my team what am I doing apart from stuff like this and like fundraising, and I'm trying to hold space and create space for different perspectives so that we can move forward to have better ideas than I can alone. I think that matters for gender equality, for health justice, and for leadership development in general.
I think so the question that I would ask is, how do we really keep space for people who function differently, think very differently, have wildly different backgrounds? I mean, if I'm going to relate it back to your work, right, you could think about people all the way from community health worker and community health system to people who are in government or even in multilaterals making financing decisions. So how do we really create space for people to talk to each other, learn from each other, build bridges, as you say?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of ways to do this. One thing that we did, that we were doing at Africa Frontline First, and if people want to hear a lot more stats about health stuff and health, you can find me afterwards, but essentially what we're trying to do is make sure, one of the things we are trying to do is make sure that these community health workers who are 70% women in this space and often mostly underpaid, unpaid, discriminated at the workplace and at home, we're wanting to help them become more professionalized in this space. Often these are through large government programs, and so a way to think about this, or that we think about this, is how do we bring CHW, community health worker representation, in the design of these programs, in the decision making about what goes forward and what comes off of the plate, in the doing, which is a lot of where the space is right now. But you can even think about the doing of it as what kinds of health workers, what kinds of programs and implementers get paid to execute this, and in the, let's say, accountability. So, and as one small example, we have some community health workers, Margaret and John, who are part of an advisory committee that really advise on the accountability of a fund that we've developed with the Global Fund. So across all that spectrum, designing, doing, and accountability, finding seats at the table, making explicit the seats at the table for representation.
A theme that now I'm starting to hear across the last panel and this one is about the importance of professionalizing essentially women's professions, right? So community health work is one great example. You know, majority of all community health workers are women, as you just said, underpaid, rarely paid, paid late, you know, not seen as profession. In the last one, we're talking about women entrepreneurs being at a disadvantage. And I don't know that there was a question there. I think I was just making a connection.
But what's really interesting is, because in the last panel, they talked about financial incentives and some of the perverse incentives that happened. We were part of there's one country I remember that we were so excited that they turned a volunteer program into a professional program. And I'll say that the intentionality of the design related to gender was, let's say, gender blind. And so as soon as the government started paying those health workers a consistent monthly salary, men flooded the market. And rather than what's on average a 70% ratio of women to men in this workforce, it became less than 30%. And so it just goes to show that the intention with which we designed these things and had more female CHWs been a part of the design process, I venture to guess like some of the reasons why you saw such a crazy change in the ratios could have been prevented in the first place.
And why do you think that intentionality in design, but also this idea of professionalizing community health workers is so important in a post-pandemic era?
In this era, we have choices to make. So whether it's a current emergency like a health emergency like COVID-19 or Ebola, or a routine emergency in the sense of maternal and child health crises and maternal mortality are all continuing to happen. Somebody earlier was saying that the battlegrounds for women's bodies are the battlegrounds for political fights. And in terms of the health emergencies, women's community health workers are still the front lines as well. So it's important for us to support their professionalization, one, because they are the workers that we are relying on, that we must rely on and will rely on in the future. And it makes no sense that they are on the quote-unquote front lines of this work in so little ways part of the decision-making process, the accountability to design. So it's a effectiveness issue, but it's also a justice and equity issue.
So you gave a great example of a way in which there was an unintended consequence by not involving women in the design process. Do you have examples of where you've seen gender transformative partnerships or community health system building that has been particularly effective? And that could be at any level: governance, collaboration, whatever you pick.
I do. There's one of our partners that we work with named Integrate Health. They work in Togo and Guinea. I've seen how so oftentimes community health workers, when they're trained, the governments will bring them to a training site or take a few weeks out of their year to make sure they get a big surge of training. They call it pre-service training, and then they go back to the work. And often what that means is if you are a primary caretaker, if you are a mother with a young child, that is a pretty big burden. I mean, even for, like, I have children who are not super young anymore, but I remember, like, when they were toddlers and infants, leaving for a 2-week trip, even with all the privilege that my wife and I have, it's still a burden. So, long story short, they changed the training program and the way that training is accommodated to make it more possible for caretakers, women, and their family to come to the training. So somebody might be bringing their children, might be bringing an additional caretaker or a helper. They also reduce the number of trainings, reduce the amount of training. So there's a lot of little tweaks that can just make it a more possible to include a wider set of trainees, and in this case, more women. So that's it's small tweaks, but one that I think, I'm gonna butcher the stat, but I think in that program, they were able to retain women in the workforce for like above 80% or above, maybe even higher.
Yeah, I mean, we see that in the literature, right? If you address the barriers that women leaders are facing, you
Yep.
can not only recruit them, but then you retain them, you keep them.
Yeah.
But you have to address those barriers in order to do that. It's a deep recognition that the systems and structures we're working in are designed with patriarchal norms.
100%. And by the way, because we work a lot in financing, it's a super cost-efficient and cost-effective type of intervention.
I thought you were going to say like financing is really patriarchal.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, that too.
Okay, so elephant in the room.
Mhm.
This is a Women's Leadership Summit.
I've noticed.
Yeah. And given the bio that I was given, my understanding is that you identify as a man.
Correct.
Okay, cool. So then I want to ask some questions around allyship, because I imagine if you're sitting here, that's a term that resonates with you.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So that's good. That's good news, because it would be bad, I think, if you said no.
It would be a very short
Yeah,
chat.
I think chat's over at that point. So I think, you've explored some ways, at least what I'm hearing is some ways in which allyship can come through, like in intentionality and program design and things like that. But maybe I just want to ask explicitly, how do you practice allyship, or how do you promote allyship?
Great. Let me start with a personal story, and you can interrupt me or tell me if this is kind of getting long. But this is a story about when somebody helped me. I was born in China, but educated in the U.S. In the home that I grew up in, by just culture or home socialization. I learned that the way to get to success is to keep my head down, do the work, and let my work speak for itself. Self-promotion was impolite and perhaps even shameful. And that playbook worked for me through most of schooling, academics, college. You take a test, you get good grades, In my first job after grad school, that playbook stopped working. It was a private sector corporate firm, and I just wasn't succeeding at all. And one day, this woman who was much more senior than I was, and it was Asian American as well, brought me into her office and just kind of sat me down and said, "You're playing this game all wrong." And she basically told me what the rules actually were for how to, you gotta act.
I mean, that's actually very transparent. I mean, the way you said that is like telling you what the rules are, right? Being very clear about what space you're in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I was super naive at the time. I had no idea. But it's like, oh, you gotta be a little bit louder in the room, or you have to. These are the people that you should work with. These are the people you shouldn't work with. When I'm in a meeting, I'm going to ask you a question, and that's your moment to say something. So this is an example of what people might call sponsorship.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think this was not in a gender equity sense, of course, but that's one practical thing that if you are in a new job and sort of in a new space, like finding mentors, sponsors, people that can help, that are willing to, and I think there are many people who are willing to tell you the rules of the game. If you are in a position of slightly more dominant power so for example, I am in now, like finding space, time, people that you can mentor, sponsor, and show the rules of the game. And I would say it's not, we want to change the game, but it's not shameful to play the game to change the game.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, so I mean, it is about still trying to change systems, but provide people the rules of the systems that they're in as well, right? Sort of giving people a roadmap that I think for many is like assumed or known by some with more privilege, and then like not well understood by others with less privilege in any given scenario.
Yeah.
How do you think that translates then to your work in community health and governance?
One thing I've been, if you'll see that my title says co-executive director, and the co actually matters a lot. The other co-executive director is a woman named Angela Gichaga from Kenya, and she and I are aligned in mission, but we walk in different spaces. And so I think how this might translate is, in order to achieve what we're trying to do in community health, which is, so for Africa Frontline First, we are trying to mobilize and increase the amount of financing that goes to community health programs. Some of that is just straight out mobilizing money, but other parts of it are trying to change the architecture of how funding flows, so changing systems. And in order to change systems, we need to both have good ideas and the right relationships and people to influence those ideas.
You know, something I'm hearing there is around the way allyship can occur at multiple levels. It can occur at the systems level, it can occur at individual levels. And one critique I've heard in my own space and work in women's leadership is, okay, you're talking about male allyship, but that feels like a very, Western lens, right? How is that going to meaningfully work in systems that, have different gender norms, right? That I'm battling different battles. And I think you've provided a great example here of ways in which we can configure allyship at these different levels.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, I think it's Q&A. If we have any questions, we have a couple minutes. Yeah, please. I know you. How are you today, Islam? I'm good. Good.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is Islam Ahmed. I'm from the MPH program and Anna's student. I think I like the point that you mentioned about learning the rules and also playing by the games so you can change the rules. And this really made me think in the context of women. Sometimes just knowing the rules isn't enough because the system and the structures are just not designed for you. And so if you guys have any suggestions on that, I would be happy to hear. The second point on allyship and also just reflecting back, I worked in Sudan and that's a very gendered setting, and having male allyship often have other, so that having any relationship with a man in a work setting in terms of mentorship or even allyship is sort of not part of the social norm. So that really hinders, and the men are always in the leadership position. So for women to get any sponsorship or allyship from men, that would come at she has to make some sort of compromises in order to get that allyship, or any advices on that. Thank you so much.
Maybe I can tackle the first one and then I'll give the second one to you because that seems harder.
Yeah.
Great. So, Islam, something you said that really resonated, right, is knowing the system isn't enough. You have to be able to navigate that system too. And so I think linked to allyship, and I don't think allyship is just about men being allies to women, right? I think it's women being allies to women or whomever, right? I think it's about a shared sense of being co-conspirators, navigating a system. I very much function by, do stuff first, apologize later. Like, don't ask for permission, you know, ask for forgiveness. And I think when in these systems, especially when you're trying to navigate them and dismantle them, you kind of can't always just say, hey, is this okay? You just need to do it and maybe break some things in the process. And you can do that in partnership and collaboration, because it shares, it helps to spread out the burden of what that looks like, of navigating that system. So it's not just you going uphill alone, but really doing it in partnership with other people. And I think that can happen at lots of levels. It's not just senior, junior, it can be junior, you know, people at the same level, or even getting mentorship from those who are younger than you, who might have different ways of thinking and doing. So to me, it's about that co-conspiratorship. Hard question.
All right, it is a hard question. So I'm going to start with saying I don't know. And I think it's helpful to, especially for men, to be able to say, I don't know, I'm ignorant, I need to learn. So we can start there. But something your question reminded me of is that power is not only in one form or one configuration often. So we've been talking about community health workers often as like, we need to get them a seat at the table as if they don't have any power. But often depending on the forum, depending on the room, depending on who you have in the room, power shifts and changes. I was in a meeting last year where a community health worker from Sierra Leone, Ramatu Jala, she was the only person in the room amongst everybody else who represented donors and institutions that had the authenticity and the legitimacy to say, this is not working. And she was able to raise the heat, raise the pressure in that room to a point where people really felt like they had to make a decision. And so maybe a hint at this might be thinking about different types of power structures and organization configurations that might help try to find a separate way.
Do we have time for one more? Oh, no. Okay, find us afterwards. Okay, thank you so much for chatting with me. What a great way to have a Friday afternoon. Thank you all.
Please join me in welcoming our second set of student monologues for the evening. Sandrine, Khadija, Michelle, and Felicity will share their perspectives on gender inequality and education and their vision for achieving a just world. I invite you to listen carefully to each monologue, to reflect on the experiences they share, and to connect their stories to the work we all strive to do in creating a more just and equitable world. Thank you.
Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say.
The numbers are frightening. 1 in 3 women globally has experienced physical or sexual violence. Every 11 minutes, a woman or a girl is killed by a family member. 72% of all trafficking victims worldwide are women. Each day, 800 women die from complications related to pregnancy or childbirth. 1 in 10 women lives in extreme poverty. For every dollar earned by men, women earn only 77 cents for equivalent work. Women shoulder at least 2.5 times more unpaid household and care work than men. Women are consistently underrepresented in decision-making positions. Only 10% of the world's head states today are women, and just recently at the UN General Assembly, only 10% of the speakers were women. Globally, women are 14 times more likely to die from a disaster than men. So wars, genocide, pandemics, climate crisis, and all other crises are not gender neutral. They disproportionately affect women. The numbers are frightening. But even more frightening is that these statistics are not just mere numbers. They tell the real stories of women worldwide, from the DRC and Sudan, where women continue to experience alarming levels of sexual violence, to Afghanistan, where they're now even banned from speaking in public, to the EU, where human trafficking is on the rise, which impacts mostly women and girls, to here in the US, where Black women face maternal mortality rates that are 3 times higher than those of white women. Gender inequality is a universal challenge. No country has achieved full gender parity. The glass ceiling is holding strong. The numbers are frightening, but you don't have to accept them. In fact, regardless of your gender, you must reject these numbers loudly. To borrow the words of the renowned writer Arundhati Roy, never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity. Allow yourself to be disturbed by these statistics and never recover until we have achieved gender equality. Dare to imagine a gender equal world that is free of bias and discrimination. Imagine a world where gender holds no advantages or disadvantages. Radical imagination is the only path to that world. Professors Heaven and Kasnabish define it as the courage and intelligence to recognize that the world should and must be changed. Radical imagination is about crafting a world that we cannot live without while dismantling the one that we cannot live within. It is not just about dreaming about different futures, it's about bringing this possibility into existence. Radical imagination is the key to envisioning a just world. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, first of all, for being here, and thanks to all those who shared their visions of what a just future should look like. I'd like to take that as a premise and kind of build on it. So if we take a just future as what our final goal is supposed to be, what are the instruments we have today that will help us achieve that goal? Personally, a just future to me looks like equal opportunities for all. And in my opinion, the one way we know we can achieve that is through education. Now, I will confess, I do have a professional bias towards it. I have dedicated my career to education ever since I was old enough to have one. And whether it was volunteering or teaching or working at a ministry of education, I've seen the power of education. And I've always thought and I've always felt that education could change my life. Let me rephrase that actually, that education would give me the power to build a life that was mine, that I created. And so, you know, I believe that education, it transcends the 4 walls of a classroom, it transcends a building, it transcends a degree. To me, when I think of education, I think about my 44-year-old student, Kamal, who was recently widowed. She was raising 4 children on her own, and she decided that she wanted to learn how to read and write. The joy on her face when she read her first word, that's the power of education. Because education is financial independence. It is empowerment. It is opportunity. Education is a fundamental human right. It's one that 250 million children today do not have the right to access. They're missing out, and there are also hundreds of thousands of children who are in war zones and displaced at the moment who don't have access to a normal childhood and development. Education is my mother, Aisha, the first person in her family from northern Pakistan to have a university master's degree. And it's her instilling the unquenchable thirst for knowledge in me and my sisters to go on and pursue as much as we wanted to pursue studies, to pursue a career, because she knew, as mothers often do, what would lead us to have a career, to stand on our own 2 feet. And although this goal of attaining a just future might seem colossal, it might seem unattainable, and maybe if you ask yourself right now, do I actually think that a just future is attainable? Maybe in your heart of hearts, the answer to that question is no. And so if there's one thing that I think we should all take away from being at this summit, it's to unlearn that, to unlearn and liberate ourselves from the belief that there are things that are not achievable, that there are missions that are impossible. And that's also what education does to a certain extent. But if we in this auditorium don't believe that, then we already have a first obstacle to get over. And that's the sentiment that I want to leave here today. And it's beautifully encapsulated in a poem that I'd like to read. It's a poem by Edgar Allan Guest called It Couldn't Be Done. And it was originally written in he, she pronouns, but I've tweaked it for today. And this is what it says. Somebody said that it couldn't be done, but she with a chuckle replied that maybe it couldn't, but she would be one who wouldn't say so till she tried. So she buckled right in with the trace of a grin on her face. If she worried, she hid it. She started to sing as she tackled a thing that couldn't be done, and she did it. Somebody scoffed, "Oh, you'll never do that. At least no one ever has done it." But she took off her coat and she took off her hat, and the first thing we knew, she'd begun it. With a lift of her chin and a bit of a grin, without any doubting or quitted, she started to sing as she tackled a thing that couldn't be done, and she did it. There are thousands to tell you it cannot be done. There are thousands to prophesy failure. There are thousands to point out to you one by one the dangers that wait to assail you. But just buckle right in with a bit of a grin. Just take off your coat and get to it. Just start in to sing as you tackle the thing that cannot be done, and you'll do it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my honor to share this space with you all today. As I reflected on this year's theme, I wondered how many years people have devoted to this question: what does a just world mean? It is a timeless question, and for this reason, I have taken the opportunity to write a letter and dedicate my thoughts to my future granddaughter. Allow me to read it now. My lovely Hope, I hope you're doing okay. I'll admit, I struggled writing this. It's 2024, and I speak to an amazing group of women who have blazed the trail before us. I stand in the auditorium of a beautiful building I am lucky enough to call my university. I am a master's student at Johns Hopkins, the first in our family to do so. All of the mentors I could ever seek, all of the books I could ever read, all of the opportunities I could ever want at my fingertips. And now I have to grapple with this question: what does a just world look like? I have studied the world for quite a bit now, and you would think that the answer would come easy. But here's what I think. I think a just world is one where your roots become a part of you, but they are not all of you. They are becoming a part of your story, but they are not your ending. I take your great-grandmother, Joanna, as an example. She moved to this country from Colombia at age 15. At age 17, she had me. She was deciding to drop her studies in fashion and was ostracized by her family, all because she knew that she had to take care of Michelle, her child. Following what seemed to be the perfect man on paper, she decided to go with him. 20 years of abuse threw that out the window. After her divorce in 2019, she was left with her two amazing twin boys, 2 minimum wage jobs, and a dream to go back to school, all while I, her daughter, was leaving for my first year at Johns Hopkins University. And during my studies, I had the beautiful opportunity to travel to Italy and Brazil and get to see the world for the first time. We called every day, me WhatsApping her from the Colosseum in Rome or the beautiful Brazilian beaches, her in our quaint kitchen of Pennsylvania, cooking after a long shift in the daycare. As I sipped on cappuccinos in Bologna or complained about an economics exam, she continued and answered every day from that same spot in the kitchen. And I could tell that she was exhausted, physically and financially, from the burdens of single motherhood in the United States. And this makes me think about the day she decided to leave her husband. She made a decision that day that 1 in 3 brave women of this country who experience domestic abuse must face. Do I leave my partner and lose the little support he gives me? Or do I continue in this cycle I've always known, hoping the pain will someday stop? In a perfect world, no woman would have to choose between these alternatives. But it's not a perfect world I'd write to you about today, my granddaughter. It's a just world. We cannot wish away all those who cause harm, who choose war, who lead with greed, but we can wish for a just world where these people are brought to justice and their victims are given opportunity. The opportunity to go back to school and continue a career in fashion. The opportunity to take a break from cooking every once in a while and enjoy a nice meal in a restaurant. The opportunity to see the world through her daughter's eyes as she travels abroad for the first time. Is that the world you live in? Or did we at least make progress? Are the children who grew up in war, are they getting proper care? How about the single mothers? Do they ever get a break? A just world will still carry hardship, but it is our responsibility, and one I hope to contribute towards, to ensure that this hardship does not seal a person's fate. In a world of justice, these people should be compensated with the help of policy, empathy, but most of all, love. I hope you live in that world of opportunity, where regardless of where you started, you have the chance for a life of happiness. Your grandmother, Michelle. Thank you.
Hello. When I was growing up, I loved picking on my little sister. And one of the ways I would do this was I would convince her that she was adopted. And she believed me every single time. It was only later on that I realized that what was to me a harmless and frankly hilarious joke, to her gave her a reason to doubt the people closest to her heart. I used my status as bigger and wiser older sister to exploit her trust in me. I used my power to shape her understanding of the world as I wanted to. I think that injustice is rooted in power. And perhaps one of the countries most familiar with injustice is Kosovo. And in honor of Her Excellency, who will join us today, as well as the spirit of the theme of today's summit, I want to share with you a quote from Ibrahim Kogova, the first president of Kosovo, who says that our battle is not against any particular nation or group, but against oppression and injustice. Now, we may feel powerless when we consider all the gross injustices we see in the world today, violence against women, famine, the DC public transportation system. I mean, gross injustices that we see, the latter of which I am intimately familiar. But as Rugova points out, it is not a phenomenon between countries or just in the big systems that we see all around us every day. But injustice is seen in how we treat each other. It is seen in how we oppress each other, in our indifference to each other. How many of you use your own power to uplift women or those in your community? When have you used your power to make an impact and make changes that you want to see? How can we together, as a collective, be better and move forward with this issue? Now, I'm here today, standing before you, talking with you, not to lecture you or shame you or tell you to feed soup to the first person you see when you get out of this building. That's not what I'm here today to tell you. I'm here to remind you that you have power. And the way you use it creates a ripple effect on the people around you. and it can be used, and it's used by all, whether to tease your sibling or to create destructive effects on society. The way you use it can enact the change that you want to see in the world, and it starts with the person sitting right there next to you in your seat. Thank you.
What does a just world look like to you?
I was thinking this question on my way here because from what I was trained and what I read in all these Greek classicisms, the Greek classics, right? Justice is not fairness. It would be an easier conversation if we were talking about what does a fair world mean to you.
A just world is a world where everyone has access to the same opportunities, to the same rights, no matter where they're from, no matter their socioeconomic background, where everyone is treated with dignity, no matter their circumstances.
To me, I think a just world is one that has true equity in terms of opportunities and resources provided to people for them to seize the means of bettering their own futures.
The biggest barrier to achieving equality and justice in the world today?
Justice and equality.
I think there's definitely an issue with healthcare. In the world today, there's definitely lots of places in the world where healthcare is not available or affordable for many people, especially women. And I think that that's one of the biggest, if not the biggest barrier for a lot of people.
I think likely that is this tendency to otherize different groups. So when we demonstrate a lack of empathy, it allows us to create these artificial barriers that are really an impediment to truly achieving justice and equality.
The most important thing with those disruptive technologies, especially looking at AI, is looking at the access of these technologies. So if only a portion of people have access to these technologies, our mission of creating a just world will never be achieved. It would just still be an ideal.
Although they do have the potential to either enhance or disrupt, I think the real challenge is for us as a society to create some sort of global governance standard that is both inclusive and future-oriented.
Priority or healthcare? I have to choose one.
Fundamentally, it has to start with a baseline access to healthcare. Without that sort of level playing field that everybody starts at, it's really impossible for those technologies like AI to bridge that inequality gap.
To me, it's not one or the other, right? I think as scientists and entrepreneurs and private capital investors, we got to work together, and policymakers, right? We got to work together and apply our collective intelligence to help bring a more sustainable life.
I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Vjosa Osmani, the 6th President of the Republic of Kosovo. President Osmani was elected on 4th April 2021, having previously served as the Speaker of Parliament, and after being elected as a Member of Parliament of the Republic of Kosovo in 5 consecutive mandates. She graduated from the Faculty of Law of the University of Pristina and received her master's and doctorate degrees in international law from the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, United States. As president, Vjosa Osmani has relentlessly championed women's rights, in particular concerning their participation in processes of peace and security, as well as their economic and political empowerment. The president is devoted to raising awareness for and supporting children with special needs. She's also committed to empowering disadvantaged and marginalized groups in Kosovo. The president's work has also focused on ensuring that action on climate change starts from the individual and gains further support at the highest political levels. In addition, the empowerment of youth in different areas, from information technology to political decision-making, has been an important part of the president's work. In the February 2021 elections, she achieved a historic level of popular support, becoming the most voted politician in the history of elections in the Republic of Kosovo. Before that, Vjosa Osmani was the first woman to have served as the Speaker of the Parliament of the Republic of Kosovo, having been elected to the post on 3rd February 2020, and has also served as acting president of the Republic of Kosovo between November 2020 to March 2021. In previous terms, as an MP, she chaired the Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Affairs, the Committee on European Integration, and was the deputy chair of the Committee on Constitutional Reform. Please join me in welcoming President Osmani.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, dear participants. One of my favorite parts of this job is the opportunity to be in an academic setting such as this one, and to be surrounded by students, by faculty, and some of the most eager, curious minds. So when I first received the invitation to come back here, I wasn't sure if I could make it because, as you can imagine, the job comes with a lot of daunting challenges. However, as I reflected on the transformative power that conversations with students have, I urged my team to make it happen. And this has already been a very full day with a lot of activities, so I'm very, very delighted to join you now. The room is, of course, filled with people who strive for more, who strive for better, and who are committed to fighting for a more just world. It's a beautiful space to be in. However, the reality we see here today doesn't always reflect the society outside these walls. And that is what keeps many of us awake at night, because I'm convinced that we can all do better. To get there, we must find and commit to a greater cause, since there is nothing more liberating than fighting for something that is so much larger than yourself. So I stand here today not just as president of Kosovo, but as someone who has traversed a journey marked by aspirations, challenges, as well as many milestones. Looking back at my life before I stepped into the presidency, I must admit that the path I walk today was not one that I envisioned in my early years. Not because I did not believe in it, but because my childhood was steeped in uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. I grew up in a country where there was an apartheid-like regime, which then devolved into a cruel war claiming the lives of more than 13,000 people in just a few months. My people were victims of Milosevic's genocidal war. No one knew what would come next, but we all understood one fundamental truth, that we must never give up. We chose not to give up because giving up meant surrendering our dreams of freedom, independence, peace, and democracy. It meant giving up on the promise of a better tomorrow. So if there's one piece of advice I want to share with you, a lesson learned through a lot of hardship, never ever give up on your hard-won freedoms. It's easier said than done, but it's worth the fight every step of the way. Just 25 years ago, the idea of an independent Republic of Kosovo seemed too far and too difficult. Today, we are the youngest independent country in Europe, thriving in democracy and the values that unite us. 25 years ago, no one thought that survivors of sexual violence during the war would find their voices. Today, they not only speak up in Kosovo, but they also empower others to speak out around the world and fight for justice. 25 years ago, many believed that a woman president in Kosovo was a distant reality, or an impossible one for that matter. Yet here we are 16 years into our independence with 2 women presidents already in only 16 years. Just a little over a couple of decades back, we were on the receiving end of aid. Today, we extend our hands to Ukraine, to the Afghan people, as well as to everyone in need whenever we can. A few decades ago, we were importers of security and stability. Now, our forces serve shoulder to shoulder with the US Army in peacekeeping missions around the world, exporting peace and stability. All of this demonstrates that there are no limits to the power of a nation and its people. Our size or the scale of our economy shall not dictate our path or our destiny. It is the values that we stand for and fight for that determine the greatness of our nation. The same principle applies to each and every one of us individually as well. To achieve our dreams, we must desire them deeply, believe in ourselves unwaveringly, but also commit to working for them every single day. It's important that we remember that we can and that it is possible to forge a future defined not by limitations, but by boundless potential. So as the reality of a resilient, independent Kosovo became increasingly evident, we, the women of Kosovo, faced historical and persistent challenges along the way. So although I grew up in a family where my parents worked tirelessly to equip my sisters and me with the most empowering weapon, our personal independence, they also understood that education would empower us, and through this, they were empowering our future. Unfortunately, this wasn't true everywhere, sometimes not even in my own neighborhood. But I soon realized that challenges were coming my way too, especially as I stepped into the world of politics. But these challenges have only shaped my resolve. I wanted to leave behind a world where more equal opportunities for every girl and woman who seeks to break down barriers is a reality. As a woman in politics, I have often navigated spaces resistant to equality between men and women. I witnessed this in political parties, in the halls where we crafted strategies and documents setting the foundation of our statehood, and even within the social circles. In many minds, a woman could perform adequately, but never quite as well as men. But each experience has taught me resilience and the power of solidarity. Conflict, politics, and the weight of responsibility can be daunting, but they also provide opportunities to learn, to grow, and inspire change. Along the way, I was blessed with support of so many other women in Kosovo who are fighting for the same cause. And eventually, we also found allies among some men who recognized the value of diverse voices and inclusion. These experiences of breaking through barriers revealed glimpses of justice, a reminder that change often begins with a single act of courage. So yes, daring matters. Speaking up matters. Standing up for what you believe matters, even if you're the only one in the room doing that at that single moment. A significant part of who I am today and what I focus on stems from the legacy of many inspiring, resilient women of my country who came well before me. Their existential role during our struggle for freedom, in the aftermath of the war, and throughout our state-building process has been monumental. They paved the way, and it's our responsibility to ensure that we never go back. It's precisely because of their shining example that women, peace, and security agenda is an integral part of my policy making. As President and Commander-in-Chief of my army, our army, I am convinced that we cannot speak of sustainable peace and security without placing women at the center of decision-making. There can be no long-lasting peace without women at the table, no guaranteed long-term security without women engaged, and nothing can truly be done for women without women being part of it themselves. By creating platforms that offer equal opportunities, we take steps closer to a more equitable and just world. The potential of our societies will never be fully unleashed unless equality becomes the foundation of everything we do. There can be no world of equalities without the equality of opportunities. We cannot achieve the change we strive for all at once. However, there is no alternative to our commitment to bring about change every single day. The example we set for future generations is the driving force behind the change they will lead tomorrow. So yes, there can never be enough talks, never too many speeches, never too little time spent with someone, never too many words exchanged, and never too much of an effort. Because one thing we know for sure is that we cannot take what we have for granted. A conversation today, a speech in another country tomorrow, a law, a policy. These moments might not transform our realities overnight, but I assure you they can inspire new ways of thinking and acting. So, ladies and gentlemen, the history of humankind has seen chapters of glory, but also many chapters of dismay. Yet we always found ways to thrive, and we will do it again. When we reflect on the reasons for our past successes, we notice one common thread: unity. Unity has helped societies thrive in the face of major adversities. Today, as polarization is challenging our societies, we must find ways to come together, forge alliances, and celebrate partnerships. Kosovo is a shining example of what can be achieved with friends and allies by our side. We are where we are today because the democratic world stood with us in 1999 and continues to do so. We need that unity more than ever today as we face the perils of the war in Ukraine, the uncertainties of the conflict in the Middle East, and the ever-growing number of conflicts around the world. That exact sense of unity is what will help us thrive as we embrace also the technological shifts and we deal with geopolitical shifts, as well as the challenges of energy, climate, as well as many others. The pace of developments we face as modern societies in modern history is the pace of developments that has never been witnessed in the past history of humankind. I'm certain we will continue to mark new heights, but it will only be possible if we put equality center stage, and we believe in the transformative power of societies standing for each other. The choice is ours: to remain divided and vulnerable, or to rise together, stronger than ever and higher than ever before. With every passing day, this task becomes ever more complex. However, in this pivotal moment, let us not merely acknowledge the strength of our unity, but let us also act upon it. A more equitable, more inclusive, gender equal, and more just society, may these turn into our generation's legacies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Madam President. That was really rousing. And so I will get the privilege of asking the first question because, you know, I'm sitting up here beside Madam President. And then we'll take a few questions before we let Madam President go on to the many other activities that she has planned for the day. So women are disproportionately impacted by conflict, often bearing the brunt of war's devastation. given the ongoing crisis in Sudan, Lebanon, and Gaza. Can you speak to specific initiatives or strategies that advocate for increased women's participation in peace and security processes? What are the key challenges you see, and how can women leaders help reshape peace-building efforts?
Certainly, I believe if we look at conflicts around the world, especially those that have been going on for a very long time, in most cases, not all, but in the vast majority of cases, they have something in common. There are no women at the table. No women in peace negotiations. No women included in discussions among the parties. And as statistics show, especially in modern history, every single time when women were included in peace negotiations, peace came faster, the agreements were more comprehensible, more holistic, taking into account the rights of all involved, but at the same time, more long-lasting. So I believe that it is crucial that countries like the United States that are very much helping parties, helping countries craft strategies, peace plans, and ideas on how to end these conflicts, that they also take into account earlier rather than later the fact that women must be included in peace negotiations. We've seen other countries, let's say Kosovo, where women have, or even Colombia, where women have had a very important role in peace negotiations between different parties. And we see that, especially in my country, that this role was both before the war and during our peaceful resistance, during the war, during our armed resistance, but also post-war in the peace building and state building process. And this has had a great impact in the results. So today, because of so many women that we've had in the front lines of these many important processes, peace has been long-lasting. Our kids are the very first generation in our nation's history that has not known war, and the very first generation that lives in peace. But at the same time, the very foundations of the country that was formed, the Republic of Kosovo, are very sound and very strong because women were included. Oftentimes, they're the unsung heroes, obviously, of all of that work and all of that sacrifice and involvement. But women had an extremely important role in all of these processes, including peace negotiations. And I think the fact that today Kosovo stands as a beacon of hope and democracy, rule of law, and human rights is also a testament to the involvement of women in these processes. Secondly, as you rightly pointed out, during every war, every conflict, women and children are those who suffer most. Not just because they, are impacted by the horrors of war, but in the case of women, also particularly because they become victims of sexual violence during the war, which is unfortunately being used as a tool of war. It was used in the 90s, but it's also being used nowadays. And because of that, they go through one of the most horrible crimes that any war has known of. So it is important to build specific support programs, even while the war goes on, let alone afterwards, that would tackle the various specifics and specific needs and support systems that will be necessary for survivors of sexual violence. So I would say that, one, making sure that women are part of the peace processes and peace negotiations, they are at the table in the dialogue, and secondly, to make sure that support systems are built so that victims of war in different categories are supported as much as they need after the war.
Thank you. At the recent UN General Assembly, the just concluded one, the underrepresentation of women leaders was stark, highlighted by Antonio Guterres, who noted that only 10% of the speakers were women. As a trailblazer in governance, what do you believe are the most effective ways to increase women's representation in political decision-making? How can we create pathways for women to lead, not just in peace negotiations, but in the broader global political sphere?
Well, I think it takes leaders like Antonio Guterres himself starting by not just counting numbers, but also acting, and making sure that as Secretary General of the United Nations allows no panel without an equal representation. He has the power to do that, so he should. Instead of just, dealing with the consequence, how about changing something about it? Secondly, it takes, as you know, I've been in politics for 25 years, and I've really had enough of men just sitting and reading speeches and telling us how things are not good when, they have the opportunity to change so much. Secondly, how about, specific governments making sure that their representatives of the United Nations are women? I think the U.S., has led by example. Many of the ambassadors at the United Nations representing the United States have been women, starting with the late Madeleine Albright, who was a trailblazer. But still, when we look around that table, there are very, very few women. We have a permanent mission in New York, which is still not at the level that we would like it to be, because we're not a member of the United Nations yet because of the Russian veto. However, the vast majority of our representatives have been women along the way. So I think we can lead by example. There is a way to change that. This is not rocket science. We can change it. How about just appointing more women? And especially if we want to get the job done. Especially if we want to get the job done, we need to appoint more women. So there is a way to change that. In Kosovo, in politics, we've led by example, but it is the people of Kosovo that have made that change possible by making a woman the most voted person in the history of elections in the country. But it shows that our society has emancipated, and oftentimes I say quicker than political parties themselves. So sometimes, political parties need to keep up with the emancipation of the society, because it's those who keep the society backwards and try to make steps backwards instead of forward. So there are ways how this can be changed. It's just equality and opportunities, as I mentioned earlier. When women start from the same starting point as men, they always thrive. They always do an excellent job, both in political representation, in international affairs, or in other jobs. They just need to have equal opportunities, the same kind of support. But if they don't have that kind of support, or if they are suppressed, if they are oppressed through systems like gender apartheid that is right now happening in Afghanistan, obviously you will see less and less and less women represented, either in organizations such as the United Nations, or other kind of bodies that we see internationally, but also within our own countries. So there is a way to change it. I think even if we look within our own countries, and I'm not sure how much you follow your own Congress, but I was a 5-time member of Parliament, and we would look at statistics. Who were the members of Parliament that would raise in the Parliament issues that would deal with the most acute problems of the citizens? Social issues, issues related to health, school, children, everyday life. It was the women MPs. It never ended up as headlines in the media because it was not exciting enough, it was not clickbait, but it was the women that statistically raised the issues that truly mattered to the citizens. But then the men would pick a fist fight, and that was the top news, of course, for the vast majority of the year. So it is possible, and I think it can be changed. But we need to go beyond speeches, and sometimes it takes men champion. It takes men champion who really want to get things done, and who want to leave behind a legacy of equality rather than just complaining. So it does take men champion who would join many other women in this cause, and things can certainly change. I think the US has had so many representatives internationally who have done an enormous job, not just in representing their country, but also mentoring women leaders around the world. And that's the way to do it, empowering others. And the more we as women lift other women up, the more we will be successful in this cause.
Thank you very much. I will ask one more question, and then we'll take audience questions. So if you do have a question for Madam President, please head to the microphone. For the benefit of students here, can you expand on the role of small nations, like Kosovo, in advancing global justice? How can countries with relatively modest geopolitical influence contribute meaningfully to multilateral cooperation and ensure their voices are heard in global organizations? What are Kosovo's key priorities when it comes to engaging with international bodies? And how do you see Kosovo working to strengthen the global governance systems? No pressure.
That's a lot of questions in one. Well, I often say that the power of a nation should not be determined by its sheer geographical size, but by the story it has to tell. And I believe that Kosovo has an important story to tell, is one that shows or is a testament of what a resilient people with friends can achieve. So we've been blessed, of course, I'm blessed to represent a very resilient nation that has withstood the test of time. We went from one occupation to another, from one colonization to another for hundreds and hundreds of years, yet we never lost our identity, never. And it went on for hundreds and hundreds of years, for centuries. So perhaps if you heard about Kosovo, you heard about what happened in the 90s. But that was just the culmination of a centuries-old struggle for freedom. No matter how hard and no matter how long the path, we never gave up on our freedom and our identity. And it's a story worth telling. It's a story worth telling. Our generation grew up under an apartheid-like system where we were not allowed to speak our language, although in our country we were 92% of the people. So a minority of 4 to 5% oppressed the majority of over 90%. We were not allowed to speak our language. We were not allowed to go to school. We were not allowed to, exercise our cultural and civil rights and political rights. Our parents were kicked out of their jobs just because of their identity. So that oppression, this apartheid-like regime, lasted for decades until it culminated in a genocidal war. And when that happened, the world did not turn a blind eye to our suffering. It came to our rescue, and it showed what democracies can achieve when they stand together for freedom and for human rights. Now, Kosovo is one of the shiniest examples of precisely those values, and we're ready to give back. So when the United States needed other countries to help with Afghan evacuees, Kosovo was the first country to respond and say, we can receive Afghan evacuees because we know what it means to be a refugee. We know what it means to not feel safe in your country and to be kicked out forcibly. When Ukraine needed our support, we were one of the first in our region to adopt sanctions against Russia and offer a helping hand to the people of Ukraine. So the power of example that a nation sets, either by defending the values of democracy and human rights and rule of law, or we have, let's say, small countries like Estonia by becoming global leaders in digitalization. And through digitalization, fighting malign forces such as Russia, fighting malign influence and fighting disinformation and propaganda. We have, small nations in the Pacific who are excellent in the way how they've developed their economy and tourism, but also because of the values that they represent. So the final point is, I think a small nation can have a big impact if its foundations are built on values. If it's just about economy, if it's just about numbers, if it's about malign interest, then your size alone or the size of your economy is not going to matter if you can't build alliances, value-based alliances. So trust matters, and values do matter. So I think there are ways that small countries can stand out. And of course, we also have niche capabilities, whether it's in the area of defense with our search and rescue teams, whether it's in the IT sector, which is one of the top priorities of our economy, because Kosovo is one of the most competitive nations within Europe when it comes to IT. We have the youngest population in Europe, which in the aging continent in Europe is quite a great asset. And of course, we're working in a number of other areas to make sure that we stand out, but at the same time, make sure that we do all that hand in hand with our allies. One of our biggest strengths has been precisely our partnerships. It is crucial that you know what you stand for, but also who stands with you. Because no matter how big or small the challenge, we need to understand that we can never do it alone. So Kosovo has been blessed with alliances and partnerships throughout this path.
Thank you so very much. There is a reason, of course, that you're Madam President. We'll take the first question from Professor Atibon.
Okay, hopefully everyone can hear clearly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Madam President. This is fantastic. I have two brief questions, hopefully. The first question, you mentioned about reserving, Guterres saying, get more women into these spaces if you think that there are not enough women. We know as researchers that affirmative action policies that say we are reserving certain political seats for women do work to increase the representation of women in politics, right? So Rwanda is like a shining example, for example. What are your thoughts on these types of policies and having countries adopt more of these types of policies that say we are reserving political seats for women? So that's first question. The second question was about what you mentioned about male champions. In your experience, right, as somebody who is, you're the president, you're very experienced in this space, how do you practically get men on board with, for example, affirmative action that reserves political seats for women, or more of these policies that will champion more gender equal policies more generally? So very, very curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm a great supporter of affirmative action quotas and measures. I've seen that firsthand working very, very well in Kosovo. So when we first established our parliament after the war, at that time, Kosovo was administered by the United Nations, and we had a large presence of international organizations that were actually, they had most of the competences in, drafting legislation and so on. And there was this Danish head of the OSCE that had kind of imposed on the then political parties in Kosovo what we know today as the legislative quota. So the men in the parties didn't really like it that much, but thankfully at that time they didn't have everything in their hands. So Denmark and, generally the Nordic countries had a great experience and a lot of positive results through the legislative quota. So they introduced that to Kosovo. When it was first introduced, the parties had, very, very few women included in their ranks, and even if they were in the ranks of the political parties, they would not be elected in the parliament. And when the people didn't have the chance to see women in the parliament and see them working and see the result of their work, obviously they wouldn't vote for them in the second election. But now this legislative quota gave the women the opportunity so that they can show what they can do and how they can do it. And once the people saw that, they were like, wow, we like this. So in the next elections and the election after that, the people started to vote women, and we as women, we were being elected because we were getting more votes than men. And then there were voices who said, okay, now let's remove the quota because you're getting enough votes. But we're still keeping it because I think until, of course, we really achieve the equality, we need those quotas. And at the same time, it has really empowered the role of women, and I would say also young women. It has encouraged them to join political parties because at the beginning it's extremely hard. It's extremely hard to get the necessary votes. There is still a lot of inequality within political parties, no budgetary support, not enough media time. You don't get in the ranks, in the higher ranks. You don't get an opportunity to show your capabilities, your work, your professionalism. So in that sense, the legislative quota has really, really helped so many of us. And when the people see you as a member of parliament, they're like, okay, she is excellent as a member of parliament. I want her as a minister in the government, which is even a higher position. And when they see you as a minister in the government, they're like, okay, well, they can also be prime ministers and presidents and do an excellent job. So the quota, the affirmative action, gave us the equality and opportunities which we didn't have. And that's why I'm a strong supporter of these affirmative actions. And I think, look, even in countries like the United Kingdom and other countries that have been there, for a very long time, we're a very young country, only 16 years old. But the statistics show that if they had not undertaken some affirmative action, it would have taken them another 600 years to get the equality in institutions that they needed. Now, we've replicated this affirmative action, not just at the national level, but also at the local level. And this has been one of the most important means in fighting patriarchalism and some of the very unhealthy traditions, as even in rural areas. Because sometimes, the situation that you see in your capital city is not necessarily everywhere. But by replicating this affirmative action at all levels of governance, you make sure that women are represented everywhere. So I'm a strong believer that this certainly, both for women but also minority communities, affirmative action is the way to go until the equality that we all desire is achieved, which it has not been achieved yet. What was the second question once again?
How do you get more men on board?
Look, I mean, I guess it really depends on the country, on the culture. In our cases, and my experience from, again, meeting so many men in politics and working with so many of them, very, very rarely, I would say, it's the case that a man truly believes that equality is the way forward for the country, because it's not just the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do, because it's better for your economy. Losing out 50% of your workforce, how is that smart? It's not. Making sure that women are economically empowered is extremely important, and it's in the interest of the country. Some men do understand that, and they become champions of equality because of that, because they understand that it helps the country, it helps the economy. But then there are many others, and this has been my experience, who become champions when they become fathers of little girls. It's an entirely different world for them then. They're like, this is not the world that I want my daughter to grow up in. I want a better world for her. I want more equality. I don't want her to go through, belittling, attacks, humiliation that, I heard in a party meeting against another, women. They don't want that for their daughters. They were okay before that, hearing these kind of things and seeing so much injustice. Well, as long as they become champions of women equality, whatever the reasoning behind, it's okay. But from my experience, in many cases, the moment when they became fathers of girls, it has changed everything for them. And so it also becomes a personal cause, not just a national cause for them to fight for equality. But the more men champion, the easier, of course, achieving all of these results is.
Thank you so much. We'll take a question from Karen and then from Elena.
Thank you so much. You're clearly an inspirational leader, and it's very easy to see why you were elected with such enthusiasm. A two-part question. A lot of research has shown that women politicians, more than men politicians, are subject to violence, cyber violence, sexual harassment, and abuse. Do you think the way to solve that problem is through legislation? Is it through changing mindsets? How do you think about protection for women politicians? And the other question related is that we're in a world in many countries where there's backlash against women's rights, and it's spreading. How do you, as a country that stands for equality, how do you think we can start to roll back the backlash? It's so extreme that in the UN, there's a lot of debate about whether or not to hold a conference to mark the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Women's Rights, because people are afraid of losing whatever gains are still there.
I believe, for countries like Kosovo, that are, newly established democracies, it's even harder to make sure that we keep the progress and we don't make steps backwards, because despite of the challenges, despite of overcoming these challenges and the many triumphs, it's still quite a fragile democracy. I would say every democracy is quite fragile. It's still the best system that we have, but it is fragile. There are always forces who want to take us back. But we've always looked up to the United States, and so much of the world has. So I have to say, what happens in the US doesn't only affect the people of the United States or the women in the United States. It affects and impacts also developments in countries around the world. So those forces that would want to take us back would be like, and we hear that, why do you want to fight for more? Look at the US. Look at the US. How come? Do you want to be more advanced than the US? The US is the leader of the free world, so just, keep up with what they do instead of trying to do more. So whenever there are steps back in the United States when it comes to women's rights, it negatively reflects developments in other countries that are very much connected to the US and look up at the US. I wouldn't say that having a 30th anniversary celebration of the Beijing platform, and it's also the anniversary of Resolution 1325. It's next year. So next year it's quite a milestone in terms of women's rights. I don't think it should be seen as something to be feared. Quite the opposite. I think these are platforms that should gather women around the world to raise our voice to protect what we've achieved, but also to show that we want to strive for more. Because if we show hesitation, that space, that void, is always filled in. It's always filled in by forces that want to take us back. So certainly, I would suggest that countries, no matter how big or small, work with one another to make sure that we also help one another to defend that progress. And of course, the U.S. We always hope that the U.S. would lead the way. But even the U.S., no matter how big of a country we've seen, they need support on fighting certain causes. And in Kosovo, you'll always have a partner and an ally in these causes. And I know we're a very small country, but we've seen that we can have an impact worldwide on these issues. And secondly, on the issue of online harassment, online violence, it's one of the biggest challenges of our time because it's mostly attacking women. And nowadays with AI, deep fakes, false videos, and we've discussed this in my previous meetings during the day, we see in Kosovo we're coming closer to an election. And this is becoming, of course, one of the main topics. So I think, first of all, we need legislation that would protect us from these disinformation campaign, online harassment. But at the same time, we need effective mechanisms because legislation alone has never been enough. So what I've proposed and what we're pushing forward in Kosovo is to have a special department within the police. It's modeled after some of the Baltic countries that deals with online violence and harassment alone. So it's a prevention mechanism rather than just dealing with it after the crime happens. So you follow the trends, and if you see someone that constantly calls for rape, constantly calls for violence, and constantly uses their different profiles to post fake news against the women, you know that they are inciting violence. Sometimes they are even inciting murder. There have been cases when, murder has been incited and called for online against women. So it's like you follow the trends, and you can find out early enough to prevent a crime if you have a special department that deals with that. And finally, of course, it takes proper regulation that takes into account that AI and humanity should not be divided. AI and ethics should not be divided. We need to make sure that ethics are kept within all of these huge and rapid developments in technology. Otherwise, it's not going to matter any longer who what policies has in an election, because a fake video is going to destroy everything, not just destroy careers, but also destroy lives. And by the time you manage to show that it was fake, well, you would have lost the election and it's too late. So it's very, very important that we have effective mechanisms who in a record time would be able to showcase what is false, what is not false, and at the same time make sure that technology is used for the betterment of humanity and societies, not the opposite of it. And there are ways to do it. I just had a discussion with some of the global tech companies, and also I was a few days ago, I was in Paris. We had a roundtable discussion with some of the biggest global platforms that are dealing with AI. I was the only government representative there, so not really an expert of AI, but of course my focus was, let's make sure that you guys use AI for the best of humanity. Things like how to tackle diseases like cancer, things like how to research things that were never able to be researched as deep and as extensively as we can do them through AI right now, and how to tackle, issues like climate change and so on, rather than how to destroy people, how to destroy politicians, and especially women politicians. But as we can see, especially in our country, the target is mostly women. But beyond policies, beyond regulations, we need very effective mechanisms that would deal with these challenges.
Thank you. We have just a couple minutes more. Elena will take your question, and then we'll see if Madam President has one more minute. Okay, great.
Thank you, Dean Walker. President Osmani, thank you for your insights and genuineness that you shared with us. My name is Elena Michaelian. I'm a second-year student, public service fellow, and the president of the Student Government Association here. This room is full of next generation of change makers and female leaders. In addition to the example you shared in your remarks, I would appreciate if you can expand on what were 2 lessons you learned the hard way, one in your professional capacity and one in your personal capacity as a human, that you think will be valuable to us as next generation of change makers. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I would say both in a professional and personal capacity. The very hard lesson that I learned is that it's quite hard. I don't know how to put it differently. Oftentimes when I meet little girls from schools, and we have these kind of meetings very, very often, in the past, to visit schools and to meet a bunch of young girls who say, I'm going to be the next president, it was really impossible. But now, when they come to my office and I ask them, okay, what do you want to become when you grow up? At least 80% of the little girls raise their hands and they're like, I'm going to be the next president. And I don't want to scare them and tell them, I tell them, you will be the next president, but at the same time, they need to know that it's a very thorny road. It's a very, very difficult road. Difficulties that you would never expect, hardships that you would never expect, injustices, I would say, injustices that you would never expect, things that you would never think a human being would do. So you do face a lot of these kind of hardships, and oftentimes by people who you thought were closest to you, and that's what makes it really, really hard. But when you're in politics, unfortunately, all of these happen, and you have to grow up to build a very thick skin to endure all of that. Attacks from outside, a lot of disinformation, campaigns. But when you work for a cause that is so much larger than yourself, as I said, all of this becomes easier to overcome. So it's quite hard, but you can absolutely overcome it when you look straight at what you want to achieve rather than stop too much on the challenges and the hurdles that are on the way. The second thing I would say, and again, because we're here among so many that are studying in the United States, self-confidence has really, really helped me get through difficulties. And much of it, I got it from the US education system. And I really give credit to the US education system for that. I come from a country and a system, and it was not just in my country, but in our part of the world, especially towards women, the education system was such that they would, kind of pressure you not to talk, pressure you not to ask questions. You might say the wrong thing. What if you say the wrong thing? You will look bad. So they kind of suppress your self-confidence and self-worth rather than build it. Well, in the US, especially in the US law schools, it's a completely different system because they prepare you for the world. They prepare you for the very difficult job that comes after you're done with your education. And that has helped me immensely in politics, as well as in my academic career, but especially in politics. So I've learned throughout the way that, self-confidence, self-worth, and understanding that no matter how hard it is, you still need to reflect that to the people who watch you, especially to the little girls who watch you, has been extremely important in this journey. So yes, understanding that it's very, very difficult, but despite of these difficulties, remain very strong mentally as well in dealing with these challenges have been important for me. Of course, different people are different, not necessarily that fits everyone, but I think even if you pick sports or you pick art or you pick, becoming a doctor or a completely another profession, even if you're not in politics and you're not in international relations, in every profession you're going to face challenges. So it's important, as I said, to remain true to yourself, self-confident, but at the same time, not give up no matter the challenges, because you have to focus on the cause that you fight for rather than the people who fight you on the way.
Thank you. Yes, we'll take these two questions together, and then Madam President will respond to those.
Can I also bundle my questions? Sorry, I made the mistake of assuming all mics had equality of opportunity in terms of speaking. Sorry, you can't see me.
Oh,
I'll come down if I have to.
Oh.
Because of the lights, it was hard to see.
Oh, I apologize.
No, it's okay.
Sorry, so thank you so much, Madam President. Full disclosure, I'm Albanian. Mirëmbrëma dhe shumë faleminderit. I'm also a Hopkins alumna, so it's truly special. It makes me extremely proud to see you on the stage. I'd like to go back to this idea of lessons learned. For a long time, our part of the world, but many other countries too, opportunity was elsewhere. So young people leave in search of opportunity, and sometimes they never come back. You're a prime example of someone who got a great education in the US and then went back. This school attracts some of the brightest minds around the world and trains the next generation of global leaders. What's your advice in terms of contributing to a just world abroad and at home?
After I finished my master's degree, I was immediately offered a full scholarship for my PhD and also a great job in a law firm in the United States. If your priority is a just world, you need to focus on that and not wanting to be immediately successful, immediately rich. To be very blunt. So focusing on a cause such as contributing to a just world, which is very, very wide, but from issues of gender equality to issues of climate change to just supporting nations who need a helping hand at this point, these are causes that will take you to the place where you are needed most. And that would mean that you will have to be ready to make great sacrifices, live in difficulties, and not just you, but sometimes even your family. When I went back home to Kosovo, I was the only person working in my family, so I was providing for everyone, including my parents, my sisters, my brother. It was really hard because the job that I took, which was working at that time with the then president of Kosovo, we had just built the very first institutions. Kosovo had barely any budget. And I had returned from great opportunities in the United States to work for just a few €100 per month, which were barely enough to just survive, let alone to do anything else. But nothing can pay for the feeling, for the experience that working for my country, for my nation gave me. Can you imagine having the honor and the privilege of working and drafting the Declaration of Independence of your country? Or working and drafting the very first constitution ever that your country has? It can't compare to any job. Nothing can give you that kind of experience, just witnessing, bearing witness to a nation that rises from the ashes of war and contributing to that. That prepares you for anything, because these are, historic challenges. It prepares you for any kind of professional challenge in the future. So my advice to young women and men from our countries, from our region, who are like, okay, well, should I stay here? I have a great job offer. Is, well, maybe you will not get paid back home as much as you get paid here. But the kind of experience that you gain there, the kind of self-fulfillment that you get there, you will not get it here. And then once you give that contribution and you get that, career and that experience, then maybe after some time you can also work in the US and somewhere else. But making sure that you also worked for that greater cause, again, which is much greater than our individual selves, is what makes you a much bigger person, a much better person, and a much better professional as well. So I know it's hard for many, but my suggestion is always come back, contribute, gain experience, and that will prepare you then for much bigger roles, not just in your country, but also around the world.
Thank you. We'll take the two questions together.
Thank you so much for being here. Just being in your presence is very empowering for me, and I guess for many of us. And also sharing the story of resiliency and hope in your country. I come from Sudan. I just came last June. I witnessed the war, and I can echo what you have just mentioned about the horrific things that women go through, and that was very inspiring for me. You mentioned that there were some sort of fears and things that sort of held you back in terms of the ability to speak, confidence. What other things do you think being in the US for some of us who are not a US, who are not exposed maybe to a US education system, we can benefit from our time being here in the US? Thank you.
Hello, Madam President. It's truly an honor to stand before you, an example of a phenomenal leader. And like you said, that now to go towards a just world, the USP is empowering others around you, including men, women, non-binary populations. And like you said, that it is better to work on the change now than to deal with the consequences. I think that's going to stay with me now for a very long time. And drawing from your experiences, how do you feel that, how do we, we talk about making the voice of women louder at the table, getting them a seat at the table, but how to do that? It's like you said, that it's coming up in conversations that women deserve, and they deserve, and it will only lead to a more better place and a world if there are as many women as men at the table. But how do we achieve that? How to go towards that? And in your experience, do you have any examples when you've actually witnessed the difference when that came into existence? Thank you.
Thank you so much. On the first question, I think your time in the US will be greatly appreciated from a number of points of view. First and foremost, the education that you will gain, I think, will absolutely prepare you to deal with many professional, political, and other kind of challenges. But secondly, the US will become your second home, not in the sense of residing here, but it will always be that other shelter that you will find because of the people here. I know that, when I come here, the people in the US complain a lot about many things, but those of us from outside the US see the people of the United States, as just the most compassionate people, so community-driven, and most importantly, with a sense of volunteering that I've never seen anywhere else in my life. When the war broke in Kosovo, there was no church, no synagogue, no mosque in the territory of the United States that did not gather to collect support and aid for the people of Kosovo. And I'm talking even about the smallest communities. It was just a country that rose to help a tiny little nation back in the Balkans. And the people of the United States didn't even know that where we existed, where we were in the map, but they wanted to help. And when I studied in the US, the community and the university where I studied became my second family. And as you progress in your career, some of the biggest supporters of yours will be this community. The very first people that congratulated me when I achieved political milestones were always the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, where I studied. So they follow you, they support you, and they're always there for you from a professional point of view, but also a personal point of view. So I would say you gain a second family, and that is such a big gain for anyone in life. And finally, networking. The kind of networking that you create, it's going to last for life. Many of my friends in Ukraine, for example, that we studied together, now have very important positions in the state institutions, and we work together in supporting them on building some of the systems that they will need once they win the war. You're from Sudan. I have a lot of friends in Sudan who are now engaged in the NGO sector, and we're trying to help them to make sure that they overcome the consequences of the war, especially in building systems that would support survivors of sexual violence. So a lot, of course, you can learn a lot from your time here, but I would say beyond what you learn from a professional point of view, you also gain friends, partners, allies. And to have an ally like the United States is quite a big strength. I can tell you from experience. How do we change it? Well, I don't know the entire answer. Otherwise, we would have seen that change, that equality already in all of the countries around the world, and we don't. There are very, very few countries around the world where you have, at least in political representation, full equality between men and women. But even in those countries, there's still domestic violence. There's still no equal pay for equal work. I'm talking about some of the Nordic countries. Someone mentioned Rwanda. They do have quite a large representation of the parliament, one of the largest in the world. But yet again, is there full equality between men and women in Rwanda? No, there's not. So we don't really see full equality achieved yet. And that's among others because we still don't know all of the instruments at hand that can help us. And not always one size fits all. So instruments, effective mechanisms that can work in one country don't necessarily work in the other. So I would say, pick solutions that are case by case based, that also take into account the developments in a certain country, but then there are mechanisms that have worked elsewhere that can work in your country as well. There have been, just to mention one or two short examples, in Kosovo, every single time when women got together, we got it done. For example, we have this legislative quota, and after a few years, it worked really well. The men in political parties got together and they wanted to get rid of it. What happened was we women in the parliament, cross-party, cross-ethnic compositions, we got together, we forgot our differences, ideological, political, and so on. We got together and we said we need to stick together to defend the legislative quota. And we told them we had to break away from the party line, which can be very dangerous because then they threaten you, they do all kinds of things, they kick you out of the party and so on. But we did break away from the party line to defend the legislative quota. And we publicly said, we're not going to vote for anything in the parliament if the legislative quota is removed. And we blocked every vote until the men gave up on the idea of removing the legislative quota. They haven't tried anything like that since then. And my second example, when I was the first women speaker of parliament, we adopted the Istanbul Convention on Fighting Domestic Violence. We made it part of our constitution. It was the very first time in our history that a vote in our parliament was fully unanimous with no votes against and no votes of abstention. Everyone was in favor, no matter the political party, no matter the gender, and no matter the ethnicity of the people that were represented in the parliament. We got together on the cause of fighting domestic violence because the women in the parliament worked so hard with the men in their political parties. And we made sure that on that specific cause, we gather everyone and we give an example that on fighting domestic violence, we are one. We are united. So there have been a lot of good examples, and it shows the power of unity in tackling these challenges, but that doesn't mean that we're done. So there are many others, but when women lift one another, when women work together, impossible things become possible.
Thank you, Madam President. I am sure you all agree with me that this has been an amazing, enlightening, educating and exhilarating experience. Thank you so very much for honoring our invitation to come. Even though you're very busy, we are really glad you're here. Thank you also for taking the time to answer all the questions. And we're glad that we're partners because we'll be inviting you again and again and again. Please join me in saying thank you to Madam President.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So let me set the tone and tell a personal story as we're settling in. My name is Anna Broll. I'm a professor here at SAIS and an energy economist. Energy economics is a male-dominated field. I often find myself in circles where I'm the most woman, the most young, and the most immigrant. So last year at a conference, I was asked to put together a panel for energy economics, and so I did. I picked the best-in-class energy economists, and then all of them just happened to be women. It was my literal rebellion to show that there is no such a thing as we don't have qualified women speakers. It's just that you're not looking hard enough. If you have a panel at a conference, you haven't looked hard enough. So let me bring you back to this stage. Do you want to venture a guess? What is the common characteristic of today's speakers? You got it right. They're best in class. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today, to my right, Karen Brown. She's a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. Karen is a feminist and development economist. Her work has focused on public finance and fiscal policy, climate change, gender data, trade, and macroeconomics. She taught gender analysis, development, and macroeconomics at American University and headed research programs at the International Center for Research on Women, as well as the Levi Economics Institute at Bard College, and UNU wider. Welcome, Karen. It is also my pleasure to welcome Loam Kidani, who is a director of Gender, Race, and Power at the Open Society Foundation. Loam's writing and curatorial work examines movement building at the intersections of indigenous governance practices, cultural production, and articulations of self-determination. Loam works as strategist and researcher on climate economics and food sovereignty in Africa, Asia, the Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Prior to joining Open Society Foundation, Loam was the vice president of global programs at Thousand Currents, a global foundation working on agroecology, territorial stewardship, the energy transition, and new economies. Welcome, Loam. To kick us off, let me share an observation that energy justice has been very important for this presidential administration. As a matter of fact, next week, Tuesday through Thursday, the U.S. Department of Energy holds Justice Week 2024. Let us start by discussing the definition of what just energy transition is in the global context. Loam, why wouldn't you go first?
Yes, it's on. Good evening, and thank you for staying. So there isn't one uniform definition of a just transition. And so I'll offer what I have found useful in the work that I've done. But before I get to defining it, I think it's also really important to set the context. So we are seeing an increase of climate disasters across the globe, but the impact of those disasters is not felt equally. From the impacts of the cyclone in Mozambique to the floods in Pakistan, we're seeing global south countries that have been gutted of all state infrastructure because of different conditionalities from the World Bank, the IMF, that are not able to respond in the ways that they need to make sure that their populations are okay. So that's, you know, the background of that. And so given that, then the question of a just transition cannot just be about curbing emissions. While that's a really important part, it also needs to be about what do we need to do in order to ensure that those most impacted are going to survive, but then also that they're able to build resilient, just futures as well. And so this then makes the just transition a conversation about staying within planetary boundaries, absolutely important, but it's also really important to understand the just transition not as a siloed climate issue, but an issue that cuts across social policy, economic policy, and also other kind of regulations and ways of thinking in terms of how we structure our political lives, all of which are decisions that we make. There's nothing inevitable about that. And so then it's about cutting emissions, but it's also about respecting the sovereignty of people in the global south of communities, indigenous communities, Black, Afro-descendant, caste-oppressed communities. And in the conversations today, I think one of the things that I found really insightful about one of the students in the last cohort that went was that person brought in a question of power. And that's a really important conversation when you're talking about the just transition and the energy transition more broadly. So generally speaking, when people are talking about a just transition, it's about, as the energy transition continues, what happens to the workers? So it's both about a question of labor market equity, about agency, but then I think the thing that's really important that often gets left out of the conversations is that it absolutely has to be also about labor market power to negotiate, to reshape, and to shape what the world of work will look like in the future.
Thank you, Lum. Now we'll turn this question on its head and would like to ask Karen, what just transition is not?
That's a great question. Well, it's not business as usual, and it's not what we have today, probably in the halls of power, where many agreements are being negotiated and discussed. Right now we have the Financing for Development Forum, of which climate finance is a very, very big part. We're preparing for COP29, as everybody knows. We've got the biodiversity world and biodiversity summit and many other related summits. And the conversation in these halls of power don't really represent the vision that Luam, I think, just outlined. So we have, and we can talk about this in the panel, small steps to get there. And we have some marginal kinds of changes. So for instance, the World Bank agreeing to make much more finance available, but not sufficient, and not necessarily changing the processes through which the finance gets to communities where the absolute transformation has to happen. So a just transition is not, is a vision, but it's not what we have today.
Thank you. Now that we have defined what just transition is and is not, I wanted to ask about the kinds of structural transformations that are needed. And you already mentioned climate adaptation finance. We talked about extractive industries during our preparation call. I can also surrender my microphone because it's so important that you have the ability to speak.
Thanks. I'm working with a colleague and a friend from the Philippines on a book on revisiting the gender and development literature through the lens of climate change. And we have a chapter in there on structural economic transformation. Many systems have to change for sustainable development. It includes decarbonization and transformation of energy, which Luam will speak to, but it includes food and agriculture as systems and sectors. It includes transportation and construction, manufacturing as a sector. All these things are completely interconnected, and I'm going to just say this now, but hope to come back to it. Unfortunately, the conversations about these transformations are in silos, and they can't be, because if we're going to really make the transformation, we have to think beyond the silos. So let me just give the example of agriculture. Transforming agriculture for me is one of the most important things in the world today. It's important for food security, and it's important for the types of activities that women, particularly as well as men, carry out in that sector. And some research by colleagues at IFPRI have shown that women are more likely in sub-Saharan Africa, where weather variability is really high, and there's dependence on rain-fed agriculture, women are much more likely to work in areas affected by heat waves, by drought, and so forth. Their economic productivity actually needs to be front and center for an agricultural transformation. But that also means we have to transform energy, the way energy is accessed. We have to transform retail value chains in agriculture, marketing, storage. We need to transform transportation systems where we're not relying only on private transportation, but public transportation. So it's really critical to think about this in a holistic way. I want to talk about two other transformations that I think are really important as part of the climate conversation. The second transformation is in climate finance. Climate finance is absolutely key for the energy transformation, for the agricultural transformation, for the other transformations. But the system of climate finance itself has to be transformed. First of all is the architecture. We're talking about the multilateral development banks, the international financial system. There's a really good conversation going on right now about reform of that architecture. Small steps. We're not talking about wholesale transformation, but essentially, and having been in the World Bank for many years, we have to really think about new ways of governance, opening up those spaces to constituencies that have been included. We need a bigger reform of the financial architecture. And we also need to reform the type and the volume of finance that's necessary. So a lot of the type of finance is debt, loan financing, which puts many low-income countries into highly indebted debt traps. We need much more concessional finance. And in speaking about the volumes are incredibly low. My colleagues at Brookings estimated that we need fourfold an increase from pre-pandemic levels for to about $2.4 trillion. And that's just for the physical transformation, the energy transformation. And I keep thinking, where are we going to get the money? We do have a lot of money, but we're not paying attention to where the money is going. So of course we have to leverage private finance, but we have to really look at the systems of public finance and development assistance to make sure that they're going to the right things. The final transformation, and I think this is really important that I want to mention, is a transformation in what I call the care economy, and people have talked about that in various ways. When you think about climate change only increases the needs for care. So think about New Delhi or any place where there was a heat wave that caused schools to close. What happens when schools close? Kids have to go home. So if you're not a wealthy woman employing people to help in your household, you will leave your job and you will take care of your kids. It's highly unlikely that men will do that. It's the women who do that. When we have climate change that increases all kinds of airborne diseases like dengue and malaria, who is the unpaid caregiver who takes care of ill and sick people? When we have floods, who really has to think through how you're going to scrounge for food and other things? We have to make care absolutely visible. So one of the messages that we've started to think about is how do we think about care as a sector for all countries, whether or not we have climate change, just because we saw from the pandemic how essential it is, but how do we make care a sector for adaptation finance? And how do we think about costing it so governments can put the resources? I did a survey at the urban level of how many cities in preparing for disaster risk think about care as a sector. Almost none. So I was talking to my goddaughter who lives in Western North Carolina. Do you think there was any disaster risk preparedness around caregiving in Western Carolina? So the US is one example of many places around the world where care is absent, and we absolutely have to bring it to the visibility. So that is part of the structural transformation, because economies, the productive economy, depends on care.
Paraphrasing what was said earlier today, climate crisis is not gender neutral. I also wanted to point out that our global economy is $100 trillion a year economy. So it's not like we don't have the cash. We just don't invest where it's needed. Luam.
Yeah, and to that point, just a quick point around the flow of finances. So between 2020 and 2022, the top 38 economies and the 8 multilateral banks spent $515 billion of new money into the fossil industry, and then spent, I think, what was it, $488 billion into renewable energy. And so there's a gap between what people say they're doing and what actually is happening. And so then when people say, oh, well, where's the money? I can tell you. And this is just new financing that's going to support the fossil economy. That doesn't include the huge subsidies that fossil companies also continue to get that are propping them up and making them even more profitable. And the windfall doesn't go then to the people that need it. So the question of finance is not, it's a question of political will. It's not a question of where the money is. So I think that's very important. In terms of structural transformation, I'll be quick, but there are 3 things that I really want to point to that are specific and actionable that I hope is useful. So one of them is, well, there's 3. So I'm going to talk again about decarbonization because I think it's really important to drill that point home. The second one is around trade regimes and trade rules. And then the last one is very specific, which is the investor-to-state dispute settlement mechanism, which is very harmful and something that can really shift. So the first point around it can't just be about decarbonization is to your point around it can't be as business as usual. When we've looked at the kind of trend around this, when people focus specifically on decarbonization without a systemic analysis around it, what it allows is for fossil fuel companies to continue doing extraction at scale and then using things like carbon offsets to make it seem as if, you know, they're gonna hit net zero at some point or another. There's a lot of different kind of problems with that, but the first thing that I want to point to is that the cost of the climate crisis cannot just be counted by looking at emissions and the crisis from emissions. You need to be able to look at loss of biodiversity, destruction of ecosystems, and the question of also resource use and equitable resource use. And when you bring those conversations in, that fundamentally changes how you're going to look at a potential solution. But if you focus, then I'll kind of ground this quickly. If you look at just decarbonization and then you say, okay, well, we have to transition from petrol, so let's not do petrol anymore, we're gonna then switch to electric cars, you're gonna miss a much more comprehensive structure than if you were to say, okay, we need to cut emissions, but we also need to ensure just access. So what does that then mean? Then the solution might be, actually, we're not gonna go into just electric cars, we're gonna look at, to your point, transportation, public transportation. How do we make it affordable? How do we make it efficient? And if you do that, then not only are you gonna be cutting pollution, but you're also creating public infrastructure that's accessible and affordable and of quality. You're gonna create more green spaces, and then on top of that, you're also gonna be creating less of a demand for the parts that are needed for electric vehicles. And those are critical minerals. Those critical minerals sit on somebody's land, sit on people's territories, and they're also finite. So we can't keep acting like we have to change the logic of the economy if we really want to address the climate crisis. The second point is around trade regimes. The technology for renewable energies is concentrated in the global north, not because there's not talent and ideas in the global south, but because of the economy, the economic systems that have captured wealth because of extraction, enslavement, exploitation of people's labor. And on top of that, the trade regimes and trade rules that govern the global economy disincentivize public investment or subsidies into renewable energy by ensuring that there are trade rules that don't allow for public investment and subsidies. So the thing that's really important is that we need to make renewable energy technology a public good and not a private asset. So that's a really important shift. And then lastly is the investor-to-state dispute settlement. It's a mechanism which allows companies to sue nation states in private tribunals, and there is no way that states can appeal a ruling. To this point, and this mechanism was designed by Shell executives, among others, so you can imagine where the emphasis is here. And the thing that the corporations can sue for is on regulations or policies that governments put into play that they think might impact their current profits or future profits. So what this does again is pit the rights of the environment and human rights against profit, and it allows profit to win. And the reason these are so powerful is that even if a country doesn't want to do it, it's embedded again in free trade agreements and bilateral agreements. To this point, to show you concretely, fossil companies have taken countries to court to litigate for $800 billion. So far, 114 or something like that billion dollars have been awarded to fossil companies who feel like their the profit might be impacted, even if it's better for the environment. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you for this answer. Now it's time for the Q&A. So we'll welcome questions from the audience. And while you're thinking about a question, I wanted to also mention, because I like numbers, that global subsidies for fossil fuels, as estimated by the IMF, both direct subsidies and indirect subsidies, such as not pricing the pollution, are $7 trillion per year.
Can I add one factoid to this, which I think is really important, which is that less than 5% of the incremental investment in clean energy has been in low and middle income countries, less than 5%. So the flows are going in not always in the right direction. We have to decarbonize clearly in the global north, but we need this investment in the global south given the trends there.
Thank you, Karen. And we have a question. Felicity.
Yes, thank you for speaking here today. So what Luam mentioned in the beginning about respecting the sovereignty of states as we go about this energy transition, especially of the global south, countries who perhaps the global policies that we have in place are difficult for fragile economies to implement, or they can't afford it. Maybe they don't have the political structure as well to be able to sustain it. And then also the point you had just made about the international dispute settlement mechanism and the fact that a lot of these now multilateral institutions are putting in place policies that kind of further inflict on state sovereignty. So this is not a new issue, of course, and I would like feedback from both of you, if possible. But what future solutions do you see? Do you see anything changing or progressing on this front, or do you see more of a retraction? And how does this impact the climate transition?
Yeah, thank you. So while part of my comment was about state sovereignty, it's not just about state sovereignty, because sometimes that's at odds with the sovereignty of the people that actually also live on the land. So I think there's sometimes an overlap, but also sometimes a difference. Concretely, yes, I think there's always, I was speaking at a panel maybe a month and a half ago, and there was somebody that was saying, you know, this is a moment where there's a lot of despair, but there's a difference between feeling despair and then falling into a politics of despair. And so I think we have a responsibility to be able to acknowledge what's happening in the world, but we have a responsibility to not fall into a politics of despair. We need to keep imagining the just futures and enacting the just futures that we want to have. A really kind of concrete thing that people are working on and have been working on since 2014, when Ecuador brought this forward, is the Binding Treaty on Business and Human Rights. And that is a really concrete mechanism to address some of the things that I was mentioning just now. And what this does is trying to address a pretty major gap in international human rights law, and by that give a mechanism for states and communities to address corporate power, which, if we're going to talk about any kind of just transition, any kind of just future, we have to address the question of corporate power. And essentially what it does is try to create a framework, a binding framework, so this is not a voluntary framework because there's some that exist now, that allows communities and states to hold transnational companies, and often these transnational companies are polluting and destroying ecosystems in places they don't live. You know, so the Niger Delta is a really great one, or the different kind of spills that happen from transnational companies where the people who are making the profit are sitting at home in their cushy, clean air while the destruction of other people's ecosystems are happening to their profit. And that is, I think, it's a live question right now that's being negotiated. I think the next session is happening sometime, maybe even next week, that needs support. It needs support both in the multilateral space, but also in the national and cross-regional, regional economic bodies. So I think that's a really concrete way where people are trying to address both a future-facing issue, but also ensuring that repair is a part of that question as well.
There's the global system, both the World Bank and regional development banks have inspection panel mechanisms that have been actually effectively used by local communities. In fact, a community in Bolivia, an indigenous community, brought an inspection panel case that was just decided in the community's favor against a lending operation that would have further degraded the ecosystem in Bolivia. So I think those legal bodies are really important. They're transparent, they provide space. But I also think that there's a lot of pressure from outside. And I think that there's very important politicians like Mia Mottley from Barbados. The Bridgetown 3 initiative, I think, is a really important initiative to try to tweak that international financial architecture and the volume and the flows to go into a different direction. They have all kinds of proposals for debt, for new window financing for small island countries, proposals for the loss and damage fund. And I think continuing to support those kinds of initiatives, that's where I think civil society can play a really, really important role in organizing and mobilizing, particularly at the country level.
Thank you so much. We can take one more question before we're out of time.
Okay, so quick question. I think first, thank you for everything, for the talk. It was really interesting. We tend to have an education that's much more focused on neoliberal, neoclassical economics, so this is really a very interesting perspective. I wanted to see your take on, because I hear a lot about the financing gap, which is an issue, and how and going back to Felicity's point on debt burdens, what's your take on the fact that a lot of what we see and policymakers defending, or economists especially, is that concessional financing actually can bring other issues such as impede international competitiveness, appreciate currencies, and again, it also weakens domestic economies, and then at the end of the day, you also have less accountability from governments because funds are flowing in and all of that. So I just wanted to hear your take on that as well, so thank you.
Can we take one more question? A quick question, please. Yes, I could see disappointment. So
thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Izine. I'm the president of the African Business Club at the Business School, and I recently took a course on sustainability, so I'm very excited about this discussion. So my question is on Karen's last comments about less than 5% of investment in low middle income countries. I have a question about how do we bridge that inequity gap in your perspective, and also as a woman who seeks to pay in this space, what would you recommend, or what has worked in terms of bridging that gap in climate financing? Thank you.
Both of these are really, really important questions. I think that there's going to be a lot of sessions on this at the World Bank annual meetings in the next week. There are a lot of very practical things that can be done on the debt front. These are short-term, kind of immediate things like waiving debt repayment, the time frame for debt repayments in the face of climate hazards, changing the different repayment schedules. But fundamentally, I think there's a group of economists who are thinking about a different kind of transformation, a recreation of what used to be called the highly indebted country initiative that started the debt forgiveness movement, and to rebalance. I think that we have to hold, and that involves thinking about the world of private debt as well as public debt and sovereign debt. There's some really great proposals put forward by economists It's called Network Ideas. If you're interested, networkideas.org. There's a group of economists led by Jayati Ghosh and others at the university, and Joe Stiglitz from Columbia University. And my own colleagues are pointing out that the debt discussion is really misguided, that actually countries can use more debt to finance the climate transition. Now, I'm not saying I share that perspective, but I think it's an important perspective. And the reason is because it opens up the fiscal space for countries to make the right kind of investments in the climate transition, in social infrastructure, in physical infrastructure. And the issue is it buys the fiscal space in the short run, which will promote economic development and eventually increase demand and the coffers of the state for them to be able to repay loans if they have to do that. But debt restructuring is absolutely critical. Now, the World Bank last year took some small steps in thinking about, during the pandemic actually, to change the debt, but we're back to business as usual. So I think pushing forward on that front is really important. The climate, there's many climate finance gaps. So when you think about the numbers, they're just so huge. So the question is, how do we get this financing? 2.4 trillion. Yesterday, the ILO released a report for social protection financing. 1.4 billion is needed for social protection. Social protection is absolutely critical as a climate adaptation strategy because people will need cash to be able to repair their houses, to meet their basic needs, and so forth. So part of the issue, I think, with the gap is not to see each of these flows in silos again. We have to think about the world of development, finance, the world of fiscal policy, the range of expenditures, and think about how they, if you invest in the right things, they create synergies among themselves. So it's not 1.4 trillion for this or 2.4 trillion for that, but some of the things that we're thinking of, like climate adaptation, I said we need investment in care. That helps resilience. That helps build human capital. It lessens the need for investments in other places, potentially. And the other thing that I think is important about the investment argument is that we have to think about it in a transitional way. You know, we have to think about it's short-term upfront money now with payoffs. The returns are going to happen later. And we have to have longer-term horizons in the finance world. The finance world is driven by the fact that you have projects, investment projects for 3 years or 2 years. That's not going to make the transition. They have to have long-term, stable, predictable finance over a period of 10 years or 15 years. So we have to think about this transition issue in the world of finance for longer-term, whether it's lending or longer-term grant-making.
Karen, I can't agree more. We need patient capital, Lom, and then we close.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of kind of different things you can talk about when you talk about debt. One of them is, you know, the language of debt forgiveness is interesting given that the wealth of the global north is predicated on the continued extraction and exploitation of the global south. And so it's not actually global south countries that are in debt. And I think the thing, again, that's really important, even in the question around debt, is that the economy is a struggle of power. It's a contestation of power. And so how we frame the conversation then is really important. And so if we are talking about a restructuring of debt, it legitimizes that that debt should exist. And I think there's a lot of different, you know, feminist economists, global South economists that are starting to think through what a very just different conversation around debt can look like. In terms of the financing question, I think there's also, again, the notion that somehow the global South is the continual kind of the request for finance. We don't have enough, what's happening? But when you actually look at financial flows, if you just look at Africa, for instance, there is more money flowing out of Africa in illicit financial flows than there is total aid coming in. So actually, Africa is a net creditor to the global South. Yeah, of course, yeah, and so many different things, you know, but this is just illicit financial flows. And in case people don't know, illicit financial flows refers to money that corporations, specifically transnational corporations, are taking out of jurisdictions without paying any tax on it. And so again, I think there's a lot of ways that our knowledge gathering, research is colonized by a particular way of seeing the world, influenced, to your point earlier, by this notion of neoliberal economics, which creates a problem but then doesn't want to have mechanisms within it to actually address or transform it. And anytime that happens, I think, you know, as students and people that are thinking about the future of the world, ask yourself, is the question I'm asking gonna allow for different answers to come, or is it just gonna bias me into the same conversation? And I think if there's anything that you take from this conversation, it would be that. What question can you ask to be able to get new information rather than just affirming the oppressive, colonial, neo-colonial ways, imperialist ways of thinking about the economy, political life, and social life? And then just the last thing to say is, I think political life doesn't just happen in the terrain of the state. It happens in every moment that you are living and existing. And the creation of an economy doesn't happen in policy. Policy is one way that it manifests, but it's how you create the thinking in your universities, in your workplaces, in your communities, that then impact how you think of the economy. So I think that's also really important.
Thank you, Lam. We need systemic shifts in thinking, as you so eloquently put. Please join me in thanking the speakers. And I would also want to thank the organizers of today's event, the team that worked really hard on making this happen. Thank you very much.